Good morning. Let me just figure out how to get this now off. There we go. Good morning, everyone. I see a few people are here already, but while we're still getting ready for the stream, I'll have a little bit of preamble here just to give everyone a chance to get in. If anyone's not familiar with things like scrolling on the screen or myself, I'm Joshua Pearsall. I can actually have that up for a minute. We're going to be talking about identity in the Global Methodist Church, and that is something that does matter. There's my name. Blessings, brother. Good morning, Eddie. And this is a big, important conversation to be having, and it's better to have it now while the GMC is still working through things, as we're trying to ask the very important question of what is our identity going backward. I'm asking, where's my wedding ring going backward, because I realized I left it in my bag. I'm missing it at this moment. But this is not a new conversation. I'm not the only one having this conversation, but I am someone that is trying to have this conversation across several boundaries. I see my wedding ring. I have to take it off at work because I work around metal. That is something that happens. But I have been having this conversation on my channel as well, really quickly, before we get too far into this. If anyone wants to see some of the conversations, these top three of the first ones, I've got one recorded with Kendall Meek on the question of authority, marks of the church, things like that. That's going to be very much worth watching, I think. So here's some places you can see a conversation has already happened in those 5 titles here. That's the wrong one here. These bigger 5 titles, Primitivism, Methodism 2.0. Watch this video right here with Dr. Pete Bellini to get a taste of what that is about. And that's something I'll introduce here briefly because that's something that's going to be important for our conversation today. So you can find these conversations happening. I'm not the only one. We just have to have the honest conversation of what is the identity of the Global Methodist Church going forward going to be, because we are coming out of a time where we didn't really know our identity. So we got to figure that out. If I can stop sharing, there we go. So I'll just close that out. And now that we're through this little waiting, I do have some things to discuss before I open up the panel. So this will be open discussion for anyone wanting to join. You'll be able to come on up and discuss with me verbally. If you'd rather just put things in the chat, in the comments, that's also welcome as well. You know, that's okay. You don't have to come up here to have the conversation. Just be respectful, be graceful, be charitable. Remember passages like Galatians 5:22 through 26. Remind me to have my glasses on. And we're here as hopefully brothers and sisters trying to have this conversation, not enemies. So this is just a question of what are we going to do moving forward. So to get into that, I just am going to put out a disclaimer. I am not saying that at this moment we are at an identity crisis. I'm not saying we're hopelessly lost. I'm not saying we are not making moves in the right direction already. We are. But there's a real conversation in why this matters. And that is, if we don't agree on our identity, there will be a time when push will come to shove, and conflicting identities will then create a conflict that won't get settled. And if we wait until everyone feels so firmly entrenched in this is what they think the identity of the GMC is, then it's going to be not a discussion, but a battle. And it won't be a good battle. I've seen that happen enough times in human history to know that if it gets to that point, odds are it won't be a good conversation. I'm not a hard fact, but it's very likely. That said, a lot of people have said things like, oh, we just need to believe in Jesus, just have our foundation in Jesus. And as I said with Dr. Pete Bellini, that's our starting point, right? But you have to build on a foundation. You can't stay there. And I don't think our current doctrinal standards, simply appealing to them, is enough of a unity. And the reason I say that is because doctrinal statements that were never wrong is not enough. You know, this is something that has been said a lot, is when people looked back at the UMC, there was nothing wrong with our official doctrine. like what was actually in the confessional standards, the Book of Doctrine and Discipline, things like that. It was the ignoring of it that was the problem. And for the record, church discipline is historically a mark of the church that the American church has largely left off, but has been something that is considered. If you do not have church discipline being used, you do not have one of the essential marks of the church. That said, there was this history of ignoring and not enforcing our theological claims. And that's because part of the identity of the UMC was not grounded in theological claims, but rather we're working towards shared goals. And so we can have differences on our theology. There was no shared theology there. And we aren't defining new articles. Methodism in the GMC is not the Methodism that existed before it. And this is true. But we have to acknowledge that at the same time, we're not the Methodism that came before us. We are different. There has been a lot of history that's happened in the formation of the GMC, especially coming out of the UMC, where we weren't as connected to our past as other Methodist movements and parts of Methodist movements before us have been. It's not like we have a very long history, Of course, we have history going all the way back to Christ, but as far as the Methodist movement as we know it, that's only from the 1700s till now. That's not a long history. So we don't have too much we actually have to go back to study, but we do need to go back to study those as far as the Methodist movement proper. We still need to go back to Christ. We need to go back to the early church like Wesley did, the primitive church, and study those things. But we need to recognize that the American Methodist movement is different than the Methodist movement that formed around the world, which is fine. And that the Global Methodist movement is coming out of the American Methodist movement and trying to figure out how it connects with the other parts of the global aspects of the movement. And I have seen that tension is not being handled well by everyone. There are some people who are handling it very well, and I think a lot of people are, but not everyone's trying to approach the conversation and understand that. But how it also looks practically is we have more charismatic leaning sides of Methodism now. Not that there's, been an ignoring of the spirit and its movement in the Methodist movement. That's certainly not true. But we have far more heavily charismatic leanings. And it doesn't seem that that's going to be going away. So we have a serious thirst as well, especially in the younger generations, but not exclusively, for my more high church Anglican leaning movement. I fall into this camp. If you watch the video, I'd say I'm a blend of 1, 2, and 5 with Dr. Pete, the aspects Dr. Pete Bellini put out. But these are not the same thing. And there will be tension and there will be differences in theology. So one of the things we have to discuss is how big of an umbrella are we going to have for the Global Methodist identity? And how big of an umbrella are we going to have in theology? Because there's going to be some things we can agree to disagree on. There's going to be some things we can't, right? One example is, what is an elder, right? Is an elder a priest who's set apart from the priesthood of all believers? Or is it purely a functional role? People don't agree on that. And that's not a small thing. That is the type of thing that will lead to division. It will lead to people doing the sacraments without being ordained or having special approval and appointment to do so. I know this has happened already. There are people who have done the sacraments without appointed privilege. And that comes from viewing the administration of the Lord's Supper, of the Eucharist, whatever you want to call it, as not something reserved for the priesthood, of the role of elder specifically. So that's an important conversation, because if we disagree there, that's going to have some major consequences for not just our theology, but how we approach our elders and what role we think they have, how we show deference to them, if we show deference to them, how we perform the sacraments. Those are big, important conversations to have. We've already agreed to allow disagreement on baptismal regeneration, or at least currently we're allowing it. That will lead to differences in sacramentology if we do not discuss that. And it will probably lead to differences anyway, but are we going to be okay with some of those differences? We already have many people who are more Baptist in their sacramentology. And when I say Baptist, I do not mean like 1689 historic Baptist. I mean the modern conception of Baptist, where they have low sacramentology. And though baptism, of course, all Baptists agree only infants should be baptized, there's not an agreement between the historic Baptist and more modern flavors of Baptist on what it is baptism actually does. Older Baptists did believe in baptismal regeneration. They did believe that baptism actually was a means of grace, not a memorial sign. And you'll find many Baptists today that still do that. But when people think of Baptists, they don't necessarily think of that. We have people who are leaning more towards that memorialist side. Don't administer baptism to your infants. That's a big thing to talk about. And we have to decide what we are going to do if we do not make that something to remove clergy over. Because I promise you, there are clergy in the GMC right now who reject infant baptism. Now, I'm not saying anathematize these people, but if we let them teach and preach, they will continue to teach and preach this. I know that's not our official teaching, right? The Methodist movement's always had a very high sacramentology. That's something we need to hold on to, and it's something that we need to be stern on. But if we're not going to be stern on it for people who are preaching and teaching right now, that's just going to continue. So are we going to do something about that? Are we at least going to have that conversation, whether or not that leads to a removal? But we need to at least talk about it, because if we don't talk about it now, it will lead to a divisive fight down the line. What's our identity going to be in handling confrontation like this? Recently, as an example, at the Acts 242 conference, Bishop Scott Jones noted that he spent 50 years editing the Book of Discipline for the UMC, and it didn't fix it. So having the right books won't do anything unless our preachers and teachers are preaching and teaching it as well. That it needs the practice and the doctrine from top down and down top. So there has been the shift in Methodism, and if we act like there isn't, we will reap the consequences. If we just keep acting like we're the same as before theologically, then we will inevitably have a conflict. The charismatic end, which should have guardrails, I think most people do agree with that, if not all people, put up to avoid the extremes we've seen in some of the holiness movements. If we want that to be part of the GMC, it is not the same as earlier expressions of Methodism. We need to talk about that. We do want the movement of the Holy Spirit, but we cannot pretend if we do this, things will stay the same. They won't. Things will change, and we have to discuss how we're going to seek to have that and a high church end. I am all for allowing a more charismatic end and a high church end, and a blend of those two things. But we need to actually discuss what that's going to look like and what that's going to be for identity. The Anglicans do so because they have more doctrinal standards than we do. They share liturgy. They have a book of common prayer. They have the ordinal. They have more things that ground their liturgical life of the church, the prayer life of the church, and the doctrinal aspects of the church, while also clearly still allowing a large range of diversity. What are we going to do? Are we going to do something like that? Are we going to make an ordinal? Are we going to put out a binding book of worship that's, hey, this is the standard practice? That's something to have a conversation on. And what will that look like in a global church? Will different regions have a different, will it just be different languages? How will we allow the diversity of a global church and have a universal book of worship if we have one at all? Things like that. Because if we do nothing and act as if we can just go back without discussing what is new in identity, we will eventually fight over these things as well. And I know a lot of people have been wanting to avoid this conversation for some reasons. I know one of them's been they don't want to force people out, and no matter what we decide, it will at some point rub against someone, and someone won't be able to conform to the identity we're putting forth. So those who don't want those changes will either have to conform or leave. That's going to be what happens. And I'm on the conform train. I feel called into the GMC. I'm with the GMC unless something crazy happens or the Lord calls me elsewhere. But those dogmatic on returning to our past, right? Because there are people who just want to move to the golden age of Methodism and stay there. If we tell them we're not doing that, a lot of people are going to leave. And we need to accept that, but we need to have that conversation and just get that out of the way now. But if we do nothing, it will eventually be an internal fight, and it won't be one group leaving. It will be a massive fracturing and splintering. I think that's enough of a preamble. I'm going to skip over some of this other stuff. So I do want to say, right, let's grant that we have our doctrine all sorted out, at least on the official documents or whatever phrasing you'd like to use. Many people do object that we don't have it figured out in the large scale because we have disagreements on how we interpret those things. It's very widely acknowledged there has been identity crisis within parts of Methodism and other denominations recently. Kevin Watson put in his recent book with David Watson, a book I recommend everyone getting, and I realize it's not that one. It's this one. And this is the book I interviewed David Watson on, Faith and Fire. They point out, right, during seminary and into my pastorate, I struggled a bit to get a clear idea about what a Methodist is exactly. And David Watson was on the committee for the recent article proposals, so bear that in mind as well. As I read descriptions of the uniqueness of Methodism, they usually seemed too broad and claimed far more than they ought to have for Methodism. Gradually, it occurred to me the problem was that they were not specific enough, Methodisms in the details. So we didn't just have a sudden shift where we have large-scale identity issues and then we figured it all out. We have this history of Methodists not knowing who they are, and that's just a feature of many American-flavored churches. The identity of many of these churches has been lost in the cultural shift. That's Rome, the Eastern Orthodox, Lutherans, everybody. There has been this immense change in identity over the past 100 years. So one obvious example of how this can be seen is how we approach the articles. In the past, in the Methodist Episcopal Church, it was asked, do you believe in the doctrines of Holy Scripture as set forth in the Articles of Religion of the Methodist Episcopal Church? To which the answer was simply, I do. And that wasn't for clergy, that was for everybody. How many Methodists today would actually say I do to that, at least in the American context? I've no doubt many would say they believe the articles, but are we approaching those in the same way as past Methodists? I don't think we are. I don't think we are. Many I know would probably raise the same objection. Henry Wheeler, in his exposition of the 25 articles, which is probably downstairs, unfortunately, I'll have to go grab that later, notes this objection is that they infringe on Christian liberty and supersede the scriptures by substituting in their place a number of human propositions, aka man-made traditions. And he adds a few more objections, but he answers that. He's like, that's not what we're doing. What we're doing is we're saying this is a faithful interpretation of scripture. This is what the Methodists believe. Are you going to agree with this? This is how the Methodists interpret scripture. Do you agree? And I encountered an objection like that just in my post for this conversation to happen. Not from nearly as many as wanted this conversation, but it was present and noticeable. Many more people wanted to have this conversation, but there were people who were raising this type of objection. And this points to another issue in Methodism today. It's that many people's identity is primarily that of distrust towards the institution. And that's something that's come up with the American culture of a natural distrust towards the institution and the many abuses that have happened from institutions. We've lost our trust in them. Of course, trust has to be earned, but many have been so influenced by their past pain and an experience, they're acting more like, I'd say, the Corinthians in Paul's second epistle, and they're not opening back up. In Paul, the second epistle to the Corinthians, this is after people have been cast out and excommunicated because of what happened in the first epistle. What happened that the first epistle was addressing. Then comes the second epistle, where people have repented and they're not letting them back into the church. And Paul says, hey, you have to let them back in. Just because of what's happened doesn't mean it's still like that. You have to open back up and you have to let them back in. So there's my preamble. Here is the link to come up and be on the panel for the open discussion. If anyone wants to do that, I see someone commented that the future of Methodism is Catholicism. I have some news for you. Catholicism's own future is in Catholicism. So I don't think that's our future in any way. I think they're about to have their own splits. Quattro, do you want to come up and talk about that, or do you just want to do it via chat? I'm happy to talk about it just via chat. But I also think you did comment on my video, and I did not see if you followed up to my question to you. So Quattro is saying option 5 in the chat, by the way. If that link doesn't work, let me know, and I'll try posting it a different way for anyone who tries to come up. But option 5 is, hey, yeah, let's do this. Come on up, Quattro. We'll do it this way. Option 5 is here on the screen, Anglican Methodism. So this is the return to a Methodism as close to Anglicanism in Wesley's time. Well, okay, I shouldn't say in Wesley's time, just becoming more Anglican. So this is not a Book of Common Prayer. I have a Book of Common Prayer. Actually, I have several books of Common Prayer. This is an Anglican office book, so this is everything you ever need. Well, Quattro gets up here. So Quattro, you can tell me if you think this is an accurate description. It's like returning to things like the Book of Common Prayer. This is the 2019. This is a older edition with a Bible in it. It's maintaining high sacramentology, which I think everyone agrees with. Basically returning to the Church of England before its own craziness identity, and sticking with a more high church roots. Is that an accurate assessment?
That's absolutely accurate. That is, and my reasoning, by the way, for wanting to do that isn't just because like I automatically think high church equals better. I think that we've lost an ontology of the church gathering.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that there's something special, holy, and unique that happens and is happening when we gather as one body. And I think that at least in like, for example, I don't know how familiar you are with Walk to Emmaus.
Yep.
So one of the funniest things I see at Walk to Emmaus gatherings is we do service.
Uh-oh. You broke up right there. He's traveling the back roads. We may have lost him. Oh, yeah. There you go. So you cut off that something that happens at the Emmaus Road.
Oh, so something that happens at the Emmaus gatherings is people that attend churches that have almost no sacramentology become fiercely protective of the Emmaus service and its liturgy, and they love it, don't want that to change. And you ask them why, they say, well, I don't know. It feels so special. And I say, well, yeah, because it is. And so my desire to return to a more Anglican Methodism has more to do with wanting to remove the sort of nominalism that is too often.
So you're still breaking up there. I think I got the important bit. You want to push against some of the nominalism that has entered in, especially into like the American context, where the worship setting is just viewed as we come together. I'm guessing it's going to be stuff like, we come together, we sing a few songs, we have a sermon, maybe a TED Talk, and then go on our way and live our life as normal. Kind of pushing back on that idea.
And by the way, exactly. And by the way, I don't mind contemporary songs. Like, you give me a church service where we sing "Shout to the North" and have the Eucharist, I'd be perfectly happy with that. I don't mind contemporary in and of itself. But my main push is the returning the Eucharist to the central point of the service, and the components that go with that. I think that we should be more serious about catechesis, and all that, as you know, my position on those things.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's my entire piece. That's my entire piece.
Yeah. A few questions I have for you and anyone else who watches this and wants to push for position 5 is, are you exclusively a position 5 Methodism, Anglican Methodism, or are you open to allowing other expressions within the Global Methodist Church as well? Like, I should ask this.
So
go ahead. I'll let you answer that.
Okay, so I am option 5. When I say option 5, I mean option 5 being the foundation. And if within option 5 we see other components of the other 4 expressions arise, where for example, like holiness and option 5 are not mutually exclusive at all, right? 3 and 5 can and honestly probably should exist together, right? And truthfully, option 5 and option 4, depending on how big you want the tent to be, aren't necessarily mutually exclusive either.
Yeah. I think the option 4 idea, it's basically, from my understanding, and I've seen people push for this, is non-denominationalism with a Wesleyan focus. So like a huge tent. I think the Methodism 2.0 is more of a wider tent for a Wesleyan tradition, but not as wide as the number 4 Big Ten ones.
Okay, so yeah, maybe we say options 1, 2, and 3, I think, can all have their expression, but in my opinion, if we want to revitalize and reshape what Methodism has become back into something to what we understand it having been before, then I think the starting point has to be option 5. And then we can investigate how, primitivism, Methodism 2.0, holiness, how those things fit in and have their expressions. Because you don't have Methodism without holiness. It doesn't work. It's not Methodism. At that point, it's just nominal Anglicanism, and what's the point?
Yeah.
Whereas you can have Methodism and holiness and maybe a more primitivist approach, and that still would be something recognizable, I think, as Methodism to the original Methodists. I have concerns about what I will admit, I have concerns about what people mean when they say 2.0.
Yeah, that's something I think that needs ironed out. So, to give my own example, you sound like a 5 primacist, not exclusivist, which I'm on board with. I certainly lean more high church myself. I think for the Methodism 2.0, what I think is the best version of it. I'm sure there's a worse version of it I haven't seen. The best version of it I've seen is looking to do like the primitive Methodists do, and I'm assuming like many people like myself on the Anglican Methodist side want to do, is go back to the start, go back to Wesley, look at what that looked like, the good and the bad, right? What worked, what didn't work, what was good for the life of the church, what wasn't, and then continue following the train of the Methodist movement. So we're not just looking at Wesley, and especially in like the American Methodist movement, we're following through the Episcopal Church. I left my little timeline on my exposition, which I think I left downstairs, unfortunately. But the American Methodist movement is distinct from the British Methodist movement, which is a lot more high church.
Yes.
It's very liberal, but it's a lot more high church. Rephrase that. I've been told that the south part of Britain is very liberal. The north part tends to be a bit more conservative. But they're basically having the same issues with like the UMC, the Church of England, pre their schism as well, where they're having these same sort of conservative liberal fights. But they kept the 39 articles, stuff like that. The American Methodist movement did not. We went down to the 25 articles and excised a few things that were acceptable in the Church of England, that the Wesleyan movement was like, hey, like Reformed theology, for example, that got the axe in the move into American Methodism as far as official teachings go. We have quite a few splits, but the history of the United Methodist movement, of course, leading the Global Methodist movement, was the Methodist Episcopal Church, which had two schisms, one over the Civil War, and then one that made another movement whose name I'm forgetting right now. Those three movements eventually reunited into the Methodist Church, and then we joined the United Brethren and became the United Methodist, and now we're the Global Methodist, sort of that train there. So Methodism 2.0 wants to keep tracing the good that happened throughout Methodism from A to Z and find out how do we apply that and continue moving forward.
And I don't know if I've ever used this term for you before, but American Methodism is, I call it, I don't know if I've ever expressed this term to you specifically in our conversations, but it's frontier Anglicanism.
I don't know if you have, but I know I've heard it. I'm guessing it's from you.
It's because the fundamental component of one of the fundamental components of American Methodism was that one of the places that it really took root was on the frontier, versus some of the other magisterial Protestant or ecclesialist traditions present in America at that time. That's why you have kind of some of these you have these kind of famous pictures from the 1890s, of a guy who's wearing all black and he has his clerical collar on, and he's also wearing a pistol, and his horse has a rifle. His horse has a rifle slung, off his saddle.
Yeah.
Um, and that was because very much became a frontiers religion. Like, for example, so my family, have been my family have been Methodists since Methodists were a thing. Like it's something I'm extremely proud of, and I cherish that fact very deeply. But one of the things that they talk about is that, like, for example, here in San Angelo, our fine fair city, one of the first churches here was a Methodist church.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first churches, most of the oldest churches in the area are Methodist churches. And when you read the accounts of these people starting them, more often, when you read it, it looks very much more, as much as you and I love a return to more high church tradition, the accounts of how those churches got started and what they looked like until maybe a more qualified elder, preacher, pastor, someone got there, it looked a lot like somebody just said, we're going to start a church here. And so I don't necessarily think that we should lose that frontier component, which seems to kind of be one of the guiding lines of Methodism 2.0.
Yeah. So that's a thing that's been a conversation, because especially with the American Methodist movement, that's something we have to take into account, is that frontier history. But what those early Methodists often still kept was things like higher sacramentology, which is something we both care very deeply about.
Well, that's why we only do liturgy. That's why we only do communion once a month.
Because of the frontier style, and I know that's something that people have sort of had a struggle with adjusting with. And I can't remember which podcast I was listening to. Everyone should be listening to Old and Modern Voices. But the reason we had the monthly communion was because of the circuits. It wasn't because we had a low view of the Eucharist, because only the elder could do it. And there weren't enough elders to go around. So they would ride around on circuits and go to different churches in a circuit, and they'd visit each one. Sometimes it'd be 1 month, sometimes it'd be 2 months before an elder came out. In some extreme cases, 3 months. Where there just wasn't enough.
And so with with some of that in mind, I don't think now in year of our Lord 2026, we have no excuse for not taking communion every Sunday.
Yeah. Now, that actually has been an interesting challenge. So one thing that the UMC did poorly was its placements of priests or pastors, where, they carried over from the itinerant system, you're not staying in one place, you're getting moved around, and we're telling you where you're getting moved around. That didn't mesh well with the development of, that worked in the frontier as churches were developing. We didn't have enough elders, and towns were literally being still built. Once America became a place where you had established churches, and a church could pay its own pastor and keep a pastor on staff, now it became able to be done on a regular basis, but that also required a shift in how we viewed the itinerant system. If we were going to keep it, it needed to be modified heavily. I know there's been some talk, like out of the Trinity Conference, of returning to the itinerant elders, because in the early Methodist movement, there were itinerant preachers. That's not the same as an itinerant elder. So so the itinerant elder system, if we were to modify it, would be you have someone in a church where there's a shortage of people who are ordained for elders or seeking elder ordination, who's doing the preaching, who's helping with the life of the church, and the elder is going around on a circuit still performing the sacraments where there's not enough elders in an area specifically. So trying to blend of, if you have enough elders, great, we'll keep that. If we don't, we can return to a system where we have elders who travel to perform the sacraments.
So you correct me if I'm wrong, but you did not grow up in the Methodist tradition, right?
No, I came out of non-denominationalism, and then COVID happened, and
as someone that grew up with the itinerant system, like let me say before I'm about to have to go inside here and actually complete the errand that my wife sent me on. I just wanted an excuse to visit with you, brother.
I'll take it.
And but one of the things about the itinerant system that it did really well, I think, for the Methodist Church
Mhm.
is that you have a pastor, he's at your church for 5 years, and if you have a good relationship with him, right, no matter where he goes to these other churches, he kind of carries these relationships with him. And
Yep.
so it is, and if done rightly, it's very
Yes.
efficacious in building the connection, right? Because you can say, oh, hey, because like, for example, like in our little conference, in our little district area here, San Angelo is kind of the flagship church, and we have all these little churches around. And because of the itinerant system in years past, all these pastors know everyone, and they know people at these
Hmm.
churches, and they all. Now, on the other side of that, the itinerant system also means that pastors kind of act politically sometimes, and they can have less than pure motivations in trying to get certain appointments,
Yeah.
and trying and vying with their bishop to try and they really want to get this thing over here because this church is big and they can pay a lot. That happened a lot too.
Yep.
So as someone that grew up in that environment where, for example, like we got one pastor where his sons became my best friends, well, then 5 years came up and they had to move,
Yep.
and that was really tough. On the other hand, when he came to pastor a church that was an hour and a half away, and that church needed help and some resources, it was very easy for him to call up our church and say, hey,
Hmm.
can we get some people over here? And we said, of course, Pastor John will be right there. So I
Yeah.
think there are goods and bad to that side, but I'm going to keep listening
Okay.
to the stream, but I have to run inside. It was so good to talk to you, brother.
It was good to talk to you. Catch you next time, brother. God bless.
Yep. Bye.
Yep. Now, since you're still listening, Quattro, you don't have to answer this in the chat. I realized I have questions for people when they come up, and I forgot to ask them because I don't do open panels often, so I'm not used to this. It was how long you've been a Methodist your entire life. What's your denomination? Methodist. What content have you been watching from and either on the GMC? And this is something for everyone to sort of be reflecting on as well. The GMC has its own official channel. Of course, I produce content on Global Methodism, not as a representative, but as someone within it speaking. Jeffrey Rickman, he does a lot more of news and stuff like that, but he does also keep up with Methodist news. So he's a channel that exists as well. Asbury Seminary is not strictly Global Methodist, but they have several weekly podcasts. David Watson is on some of them. So, of course, Global Methodism comes up. Andy Miller the Fourth with Wesley Biblical Seminary has his own channel. I think it's just called Andy Miller the Fourth. I think that's the title of his channel. Matt O'Reilly has the Theology Project. There's a pastor near me. He's in Lamont, Oklahoma. I filled in the pulpit there last week for him. He has the Uncomfortable Grace podcast. So, and that's something anyone can put in the chat if you don't plan on coming up. Still feel free to put those. I think something we need to be doing today is listening to modern conversations and older stuff. Other questions I think people can reflect on. Are you in a class or band meeting? Do you agree with entire sanctification? And what do you see as the things that can presently be binding on to our identities and unifying us? And how can we form around that? And how do we think we should be interpreting them in light of the 5 listed options? So it's going to be stuff like the 25 articles, Wesley Standard Sermons, the Confession of Faith, the general rules, stuff like that. If anyone else wants to come up, the link is in the chat, or you can feel free to put some stuff there. Otherwise, I'm going to have some things I'm going to recommend personally as far as a study of our history. Because for anyone to know your identity, you need to know your own history. Like Walter was talking about, the fact that, the itinerant system as the UMC was doing, it wasn't all bad. They just, on the whole, it had a lot of problems because of how it was being handled. There is a very good way to do them, and it just has to be modified for a modern context. Things have to be taken into account. Henry Wheeler, I've talked about several times on this stream. As far as I know, there's not a good autobiography of him. There's a few pages in a encyclical from Carver County in Pennsylvania. So not much. But he wrote an exposition of the 25 articles, an exposition of the Apostles' Creed, history of the deaconesses and the church age, throughout the church age, and a few other spiritual works. But he was a circuit writer in his own time. He had quite a few circuits he wrote around on throughout his life. And he was a chaplain during the U.S. Civil War. Bear in mind, he was born in 1835 and died in 1925. Right, the Civil War is not that long ago. Stuff like that. So that's pretty recent in our history. As far as the American Methodist movement goes, anyway, there's not a ton of history that needs to be covered. There is a lot there. Don't get me wrong. The United States is huge. That's why a lot of American histories tend to cover so many things. So get a history book, The Story of American Methodism by Frederick Norwood. I'm not aware of any good video content on the history of American Methodism. Unfortunately, I've been trying to find good video content. There's a bunch of short stuff that covers specific figures and highlights, but I'm not aware of any digital media that does it. If you want to read some more earlier sources, I don't bust this out often. This normally sits right here behind my statues of John Wesley and Francis Asbury. This is, because it's very old, this is, as you can tell, beat up. I don't want this to get too damaged. This is the history of Methodism. It comes in 3 volumes. This is a facsimile, I believe, or maybe this is the original, by Abel Stevens. These were a great gift from my friend Pippin. If you're watching, Pippin, I treasure these. And there are 3 volumes on the history of Methodism. So we need to know our own history. There have been good recent works on this. Such as Kevin Watson's Doctrine, Spirit, and Discipline. This is a really good thing to be watching here. Hey, that's entirely fine. Nectimus, if you want to answer some of those questions in the chat, I'm happy to dialogue via the text chat as well. But studying American history, get things like this. If you get those Scott Abel ones, those are good. Though those are, of course, far more thorough than these 2 works. This is going to, these are still, these aren't small works, but we need to know our own history. This is important. So study those things. Short works. If you need to study everyone should study the history of Wesley. This was the standard for a very long time. There's a second edition of this, Wesley and the People Called Methodist, for the early Methodist movement. A good one as well. I don't agree with everything. William, or also known as Billy Abraham, put in Methodism a very short introduction. To give a look, a lion's share of the start here is given to the early Methodist movement. Oh, that was absolutely the wrong page here. And only a few pages are given to the modern American movement in comparison to the first one. A little bit, basically the middle. And then the last part's covering the impact of Methodism and the future of Methodism. It's still a good book. I don't agree with everything. Like, he has this, the roots, classical development, and offshoots of Methodism. As you can see, I've scribbled in some notes of disagreement, shall we say. Things like that. But we also need to just be reading theologians. So actually, I know the perfect book to start with for this. The first book I'd recommend on this front is just exploring the saddlebag of classic Methodism. This is something you could do in a day. And it's one of those things you come back to. This is a resource book, more or less. So resource books aren't meant to be a thing you just sit down and read front to end, that you can with this because it's so short. It's meant to be something you come to as you need it. So the front part of this would be a sit down and read in a day. It's about 22 pages. As you go through the rest of it, it's going to be, here's classic English Methodist literature. So Wesley, the sermons of Wesley, the articles of Wesley, the Christian Library, Adam Clarke. And there's some debate around Adam Clarke, but Adam Clarke's listed in here. Richard Watson covers people like William Burt Pope, some of the lesser known. And then he moves into American literature. So to start the track of studying our history and our theologians, this is a great book to get because it will just list them all out. Not all of them, but a large majority of them out for you. A recent figure I would talk to, and I talked about this in my interview with Pete Bellini a little bit, is Thomas Oden's. This is his autobiography. I do recommend this. It's a great look into the life of a conservative Methodist during the time of the United Methodist Union, and he was part of the movements that were trying to reform the United Methodist from within. He's got another book in here we'll talk about when we start talking about theology and doctrinal standards and things like that. But Thomas Oden, he wrote a 4-volume systematic on John Wesley, is a 3-volume systematic theology. That's different than the 4 volumes of John Wesley. He's written the Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture. These are the paperback editions. He's written several church histories. There's a few video lectures up online from when he was alive. He passed away in 2016. He actually lived not too far from me down here in Oklahoma. He lived in Oklahoma, and I could have, if I'd become a Methodist sooner, I could have actually gone and visited him. So it's a little unfortunate there. It's a little unfortunate on the timing there. And I realized I didn't actually I briefly describe these 5 views. Classic Christianity. Yep. That's the 1-volume abridgment of his 3-volume systematic theology. And I've seen a lot of seminaries use one or the other for their systematic theology textbook. You know, one of my classes, I actually went through both. I had one class that used the 3-volume one, and then one class that used the 1-volume one. Now, when they used the 3-volume one, they picked certain parts out of it relating to what we were covering in the class. And then in my, I think it was the equivalent of my systematic theology class, I had 2 more or less for some reason. That class used the single volume abridgment of them. So it's still a thick work, still one I highly recommend. Let me open up my conversation with Pete Bellini. So it is worth discussing these 5 views quickly. And again, links in the chat for anyone who wants to come up. But one is primitive Methodism. It renounces our liberal progressive past, which I think everyone's on board with in the GMC. Jumping over the past, but it wants to jump over the past generation or generations and jump straight to John Wesley. Adherents retrieve what they believe to be the early Methodist essentials from the notes, article, sermon, etc., and they focus on originalism and contextualism rather than modern thoughts. Early Methodism is what everything else is to be measured by. It calls for a return to band meetings, class readings, etc. And by return to band meetings, class meetings, it's return to them as they were done in Wesley's day. A lot of us are all on board with returning to band meetings and class meetings, but we're not necessarily so strict on how it is we do that. There can be some update as we move into Methodism 2.0. So it's classical Methodism with an update. It honors the heritage, but doesn't romanticize it. It recognizes we live in a different place and time, so we need that. We need that firm foundation, but it doesn't need to be literally recreated. So it still holds to the principles and documents, but is more focused on contextualizing Methodism today. We implement the spirit of Methodism in our time today. It is more open to how the Spirit has moved since the day of John Wesley within Methodism, which hence the update language. What has God been doing? So it's first perhaps focused on building the kingdom and then applying Methodism to it. And as Pete Bellini and I talked a lot, these aren't like a one and nothing else. A lot of this is, a lot of people will probably fall into multiple categories, and it's more of a sliding scale than a strict this and only this. There's the Wesleyan holiness idea of identity, which is more focused on the doctrine of entire sanctification, which we all agree with. This is just a primary focus for this movement. And holiness, it is the center of our identity. And the discussion on the tension of immediate sanctification and the tension of growth in sanctification is a big conversation in this part of the movement. Immediate and entire sanctification is available here now in this idea. And this Wesley did think that it was available here now, but Wesley had a more gradual maturing approach to sanctification, and eventually one would become entirely sanctified. But we don't hear the here and now with the expectation as often. Right? There's not as much focus on the here and now in a lot of movements in Methodism throughout history. This movement, the holiness movement, that's what started the holiness movements that came out of Methodism, was this focus on the here and now of entire sanctification. And funnily, that's what's behind the Pentecostal. If anyone has ever experienced, there's a branch of Pentecostalism that says the speaking of tongues. Some will go as far as say necessary for salvation, but it's the sign of entire sanctification. It comes out of this idea. It's a later development of it that went too far. So this would then be a focus on grafting us into the larger method, into the larger holiness movement. So we'd be looking. This movement would especially be looking a lot more at the Free Methodists, the Nazarenes, Salvation Army, the Wesleyans, stuff like that. And the Wesleyans and the Global Methodist, the Wesleyan Church and the Global Methodist Church are very friendly for anyone wondering. I think we should be. It's just a question of what does our identity look like moving forward. Some would very lean heavily into that. Some would want to be more explicitly Methodist. But that also matters in how we're interpreting our history. Are we going to be interpreting it through the conservative historical lens that shapes our theology in the direction of holiness, or are we going to be doing something else? So just like everything else, there's not a monolith here. There's a variety, but it focuses on these things in the 19th century interpretation of our roots. So, there's, of course, this risk then with this of leaning towards a lower sacramentology. This has happened in a lot of the holiness movements. And there have been a lot of holiness authors in my own seminary reading plans that have been arguing for, hey, we in the holiness movements, Wesleyan movement, etc., need to return to higher sacramentology. Pentecostals added a third work of after entire sanctification, and that is the blessing of tongues as the initial sign. Yep. The next is Big Tent evangelicalism, more or less non-denominationalism with a Wesleyan flavor. We'd still maintain our Wesleyan distinctives, but we'd hold them in tension with orthodoxy of the great tradition and evangelicalism. Whether that's Bevington's essentials combined with Wesleyan distinctives, it takes the Wesleyan tradition but puts softer edges for a broader appeal, as Dr. Bellini put it. It cites Wesley saying Methodism was a hair's breadth from Calvinism. It point to Welsh Methodism. This movement would be more open to the Calvinist Methodist that existed. This is something that most of the Methodist movement removed, right? So we come out of the Anglican tradition, which has an Armenian flavor. It has a Calvinist flavor. It has a neither of those flavor. Anglicanism has allowed diversity on the soteriology debates, which is a good thing to be doing. The Wesleyan movements very much settled on the Armenian side of the Anglican tradition and removed that Reformed-leaning side. We did that in our official teachings and our doctrinal standards, and that has been a common development. The exception would be the Welsh Methodist, but as far as I know, the Welsh Methodists in many areas largely just became Reformed or even joined the Reformed churches in their area, becoming an official communion, which is the natural conclusion of that, which is fine to be doing. I'm all for reunification. This movement accommodates the wider range of Wesleyan evangelicalism, so it's open to more views on baptism, more views on the episcopal structure, more views on inerrancy, continuationism. The extent of depravity would have more wide views, the atonement models, etc. Those are things I think we need to be a bit tighter on, personally. It focuses on evangelical in the modern sense of Wesley's Catholic spirit. So it'd be more similar to the evangelical free church, which is Reformed leaning, or the evangelical covenant. And then the last one was Anglican Methodism, which Quattro came up here as a representative of. And there's going to be flavors here. I've seen a fairly wide range of how Anglican one wants the Methodist movement to be. And for what they think Anglicanism is. Some people will look at the early high church elements of Wesley's time. Some people look at Anglicanism as it's gone through the ages and say, what the Anglican Church has done, that's what we need to do. Stuff like that. So this is a response to the rejection of tradition, moving to direction and guidance in an age of too many options, looking for something more grounded in its historical roots. They're looking for the authority that has carried forth the tradition and preserved it, leaning heavily into Wesley's own view, high church Methodism, like the primitive focus on returning to our roots, but specifically on the Anglican side. So it leans heavily into liturgy, the Book of Common Prayer, Eucharistic theology, etc. This is, for anyone who was watching my channel, not surprising what I lean towards. Looking for a tethering to the historic church to anchor itself and be less blown around. It's very focused on what it is, not in regards to Protestant identity, and reacting to that. So I would personally be a blend of 5, 2, and 1. Probably that's where I would fall. Salvation Army. For example, stopped doing the sacraments at some point. So the Salvation Army was never meant to be a denomination. It became one. I'm not entirely sure of the history of how it became one, but they don't do the Lord's table, like uh, whatever we want to call it. I call it Eucharist, but the Lord's Supper, the table, they don't do that. I don't think they do baptisms either. It was always meant to be a service, not a movement, or a movement and a service, not a denomination. So, you know, the historic marks of the church are the Word of God and the right preaching, the sacraments rightly administered, and if you're not performing the sacraments, then institutionally you shouldn't be called a church. That's an argument I would make, because that's one of the things that you do as a church. If you're not doing that, then you might be a gathering of believers, but institutionally, you're not doing the functions of the church and acting as a church. And then the third one has been discipline. Some have counted that as a mark of the church, some have not. Wesley did himself, so things like that. There's a big debate there. Yes, I do agree here. I am not interested in Eastern Orthodoxy. It has appealed to me at one time, but that has since gone. Xenophon, I see your question here now. I have an interview with Javier Perdomo up online, and I could add a lot more to it now. But I did not go Eastern Orthodoxy. I felt a lot of the claims, and it's the same with Rome. Though Rome with the papacy got dismissed a lot sooner, but we're the infallible church, unchanging. Our traditions are the same as the early church, things like this. Well, that's just historically not true, objectively so. And I can't get over some of the official theology. I'm not on board with a lot of the Marian prayers, things like that. Someone messaged me about glasses. If anyone has any specific questions around global Methodism, identity, things like that, I am going to go message someone really quickly who was interested in this conversation. I haven't seen them pop up. I know this is early in the morning for a lot of people. For me, it's 9:30 Central Standard Time. This started at 8:30 Central Standard Time. And I know for a lot of people on a Saturday, that can be kind of early, especially when you get into moving time zones. You're not going to have the same things going on here. So if anyone has questions or wants to come up, feel free to let me know. I just need to go find this person really quickly. That might take me a bit longer than I had anticipated, though. So let me open up my StreamYard over here to the side. I like this. A big reason I went from Pentecostal to Anglican instead of Methodist is that so many of the Orthodox Methodist churches near me are very evangelical and have poor sacramentology. And this is a feature in American Methodism, unfortunately. There is a lot of low sacramentology. Though I'm high church leaning myself, I think we do, especially in light of the American Methodist tradition and the Methodist tradition at large, need to be open to different expressions. So when I say expressions, I don't mean different theology. I don't mean different doctrine. We need our high sacramentology, but the way in which our worship is expressed can look different. I prefer hymns. I like doing responsive psalms, things like that. I like a lot of those things. I'm also entirely fine now. I used to be a bit of a snob about it. Thankfully, the Lord broke me of this. But the use of contemporary music, less liturgical worship settings, as long as it's reverent, as long as it's showing honor towards God, as long as it's following what has been commanded to be done in worship, which is relatively little compared to some of the other clear, explicit commands around how worship is to be done, then, things like that. I am not finding. There we go. I found them. So I'm going to message them now. They might not be awake. But just in case, might as well reach out to them. But anyone who doesn't know a lot of the work I do here on the channel, I don't just talk about global Methodism. There's a lot of stuff around apologetics, a lot of biblical study, and I'm definitely trying to do that all from a very Methodist focus. So Methodist focused apologetics, Methodist focused biblical studies, and I want it to, of course, be usable for anyone and everyone. I think Methodism, as David Watson said it very well, Methodism is a branch of the universal church, and how he explains that, I think, is great in his book Faith and Fire. But a lot of what we teach is taught by the universal church, and we have a few specific points of doctrine like entire sanctification that may be unique to us, and our emphasis is absolutely on holiness and sanctification. It's not to say other traditions don't have holiness and sanctification and have very good doctrine around holiness and sanctification, but for us, that is our focus, that is our emphasis. And though that can certainly go too far at times, it has, I think, served us well and allowed us to keep a lot of the marks of what I'd say the primitive church. I had a feeling that was you, based off of the comments that have overlapped. I had sort of pieced that together, but yes, I do know who you are. Did I have something else specific here? No. So, well, they may or may not show up. The next thing to talk about in terms of Methodist identity is, of course, doctrine. So there's not only to be different flavors, but our core theology, people need to be the same. And if you want stuff on class meeting and band meetings, Kevin Watson's, as far as like a practice goes, these are great books to get. I would highly recommend getting Kevin's books, but I think as a Methodism 2.0 leaning, when we apply class and band meetings today, one, we don't need to use the same names. I prefer the same names. But how we do that today doesn't have to look the same. So in original band and class meetings, you met once a week, every week for an hour. And for a long time, it was required to be in a class meeting to be in a Methodist church. If you weren't attending a class meeting, you weren't showing up for the Sunday worship, which some people want to return to, some people don't. So set aside that conversation for now. That can be a conversation for another day. You have a blessed day as well. I'll just say veneration for Wesley is not the same as Eastern Orthodoxy veneration. So our definitions of veneration are not going to be the same theologically. But on class and band meetings, I know a lot of people, they meet digitally now, not in person, especially because a group might start in person in one area, but as life goes on, you might literally move physically to different areas. I know several groups that happened with, they started in a local area. People went down to Texas, further up north in Oklahoma, other states even further out entirely. It's like, well, you literally can't meet in person. So they'll meet digitally and have their class or band meeting that way. But we do need to have some conversation on the doctrinal standards. So this matters. For this, a very good overall book would be Thomas Oden's. Oh, wait, no, this is the wrong book. I must have let that one downstairs. I also recommend this one, John Wesley's Scriptural Christianity by Thomas Oden. Kenneth Collins is a similar book. I must have just left that entire stack of books downstairs. So Thomas Oden wrote a book called The Doctrinal Standards in the Wesleyan Tradition, and it goes over a bit of history. But it's largely a explanation and a defense of the doctrinal standards. So for the Global Methodist Church, and I'll double check this to confirm this, it is the 25 articles, which has been part of a recent discussion because of there was a proposal for the United Methodist Church when it formed to take two doctrinal standards that existed in the United Brethren and the Methodist Church. That was just the name of the denomination, the Methodist Church. And that was the 25 articles as we have them still. And the Confession of Faith is what it's called, which was 15 articles. And though there's been some discussion on tension between the two, I don't think there's as much disagreement as some people have said is between them. I haven't found any disagreement The only thing I found is maybe some difference in emphasis, some different language, and the EUB will go more in depth on a few things. So there are differences. I don't think that's conflict. I don't think that's tension, right? When I read those two things, they feel like two documents that go together pretty easily. If anything, the 15 felt more like a bit of an expanded commentary on the 25. So I wasn't sure, and I still am not sure. I've tried to sort out some of the thoughts on that. Why can't I find my own notes and resources? And so that produced what was the proposed articles of religion that our general conference will be voting on this year in the August-September time. It's in, I think, 38 days from now. I'm pretty sure. There we go. So our official confessional documents in the Global Methodist Church are the 25 Articles of Religion, John Wesley's Standard Sermons. This is a bit more than just John Wesley's Standard Sermons, but this is an edition I recommend. There's another edition by Kenneth Collins and Jason Vickers. They both have introductions to the sermons. So do with that what you will. I've seen them both used as textbooks as well. The historic creeds of the Western branch of the church, so the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed. The 25 articles, as we've been talking about, the Confession of Faith, and I can grab a link to that one. I know, actually, maybe not everybody's read that one, so I'll throw a link to that one in the chat. The 25 articles, those are all over the place. You can find them. You can find a physical edition as well. I have my own physical one. I walked through this on the channel. I've written in it. There's literally just a playlist on my channel, the 25 articles. You can go go through the whole thing there. And the Wesley's notes on the Bible. I believe the New Testament is binding. I think the Old Testament is binding. And then there's the general rules. And this is something that's very important. Where did that little book go? So this is 3 simple rules, Wesleyan way of living. The general rules, a lot of people think of just the 3 we hear, which is do no harm, do good, and then the third one will be interpreted is not the right way. It'll be stated in one of 2 ways. It'll either be stay in love with God or pursue the ordinances of God. And that's because the ordinances, the Lord's Supper, prayer, reading scripture, help us to stay in love with God and love our neighbors. But that's when most people think of the general rules, that's what they think of. Do no harm, do good, stay in love with God. That's not the general rules. That is a simplified version of the general rules, so it's easier to memorize. That encapsulates what the general rules are doing. But the general rules are actually a pretty decent document as far as what people are be doing. And this used to be what people from the laity down were expected to be holding. So it's not a huge document, but as far as expecting all people to hold to as practice, it's pretty substantial. So it came about near the end of the 1739 discussions, and people were deeply convinced of their sins. One of the rules, you needed to be in a class meeting. Each person was in a class once a week at least in order to inquire how their souls prosper, to advise, reprove, comfort, or exhort as occasion may require, and to receive what they are willing to give toward the relief of the preachers, church, and poor. So you also would gather money. This would be a time to do that. There's a great story in England. Oh, I'm forgetting his name. This is the only reference we have to him. He doesn't exist in other extant Methodist literature. This is how we know about him. It's not Fletcher. I can't remember his name. He was a captain, and he was someone who was decently well off. So he's the reason this likely got instituted. And there were people who needed relief. And he said, well, we have class meetings that gather. Why don't we ask those class meetings to give money each week? Give what they can. If everyone give a penny, awesome. That'd be a great minimum requirement if someone can afford that. And people were on board with this. This was a way to raise money to help feed people who were struggling in the Methodist communities, to help with books, things like this, publishing. And he said, give me the poorest ones. And if they can give a penny, wonderful. If not, I will give the penny. And of course, a penny back in the 1700s was worth a lot more then than it is now before we discontinued the penny. So he himself was often giving the 12 pennies a week for his class. And that's where that sort of foundation here. Of the definition of the Chalcedonian. Yes, I'm sorry, the Chalcedonian Creed. So we've that is part of the Nicene Creed, I believe. Or is it the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed? We all know that creed. I know that. But yeah, I'm on the Chalcedonian side. That's the creed we take. Now, I can say this from a bit of a historical perspective. I'm a giant historical nerd. This matters for our identity. For most people, it's just going to be accepting the Chalcedonian Creed and moving on. From the other side of the split, Nestorius himself doesn't actually seem to have been a Nestorian. There were people who held to Nestorianism. So the condemnation of that teaching still matters. I don't want anyone to mishear that. But if you read the Bazaar of Heraclides, which is from Nestorius, he very clearly seems to have actually agreed with the substance of the Chalcedon debates. And he was arguing on terms. Now, from the very get-go, if he agreed with what they were teaching, he should have just yielded on the language. This is something, I understand people can be nitpicky on language, but when it comes to proper order of the church, if the theology is there and your church is telling you, hey, this is the terminology we're using, just use the terminology. Just do it. Get over it. That being said, a lot of the stuff that happened to Nestorius was absolutely vile. If you look at how Cyril acted, like Cyril, as far as actions go, he was kind of the villain between those two. It was a pretty bad episode. There was some pretty crazy stuff that happened. Like Cyril got locked up and then used the church's money to bail himself out because of some of the stuff that had happened. For things he actually did. People tried to kill Nestorius several times. He died in exile, unfortunately. But there were absolutely people in his own time holding to that teaching. And he did not help himself by being obstinate. The entire thing could have been avoided. Unfortunately, it wasn't. And then, of course, some people took it further with the Miaphysite, Monophysite controversy, stuff like that. So stuff like that happened. But that's my brief approach to that conversation. So does anyone have other questions relating to global Methodism, the conversation of identity? Because I'll just keep talking about these. And this is important. Wesley said to be reading all the time because it's to help us grow. And it's not just theological works. We'll get to some non-theological works in a second. But like things we need to be to be passionate about the basics. This is Timothy Tennant's This We Believe. This is just a short devotional walking through the Apostles' Creed. It can be used as a catechism tool for new believers or as a devotional for more seasoned believers. And I recommend you do that. You need to have something that grounds you in the basics, because if you're not passionate about the basics, you will get lost in the other details. You will get lost in the other details. This is recent. So this is David De Silva's Catechism. It's called Christian Faith and Doctrine, an annotated catechism for the Global Methodist Church. And the catechism has gotten a lot better than it originally was. I see your question. I see a 3. I am currently attending Asbury Theological Seminary. I'll be graduating next year, and then I'll be pursuing my PhD after that. Maybe with Asbury, maybe not. It'll just depend on scholarships. But this catechism is based on the United Brethren's Confession of Faith. So there are 15 articles, and of course this is a decent catechism. This is a good size for a catechism. I would recommend this. I think this is a great catechism for the Global Methodist Church to be using right now. We don't have a better catechism. We have some decent catechism questions, but this is pretty solid, and that's just important to be having. But we also, and I know this is not for everybody, but a lot of people also use these the wrong ways. This is a systematic theology by Thomas Summers. He's not our only systematic theologian. There's plenty of other systematic theologians that have existed, but this is what you look. This is a resource thing. You pick this up when you're studying on a specific topic. So, as the subtitle here is a complete body of Wesleyan Arminian divinity, consisting of lectures on the 25 articles of religion, arranged and revised with introduction, copious notes, and a theological glossary. I love these older titles. So things like that. But we need to be doing more than just reading theology books. Hold on. There we go. Oh, I forgot one more. Yeah. Oh, congrats on the Asbury Master's of Divinity. I do know Sid Johnson. I'll be emailing him in a few weeks. I tried to get him to actually come on the channel the past little bit, but he was too busy. He said email him later. So I set a calendar reminder to email him later. Actually, I can just go schedule an email to automatically send itself. I'll do that when this is done. But one of the things we should be doing is reading histories. And I mean church history especially, but not just church history. Of course, everyone's going to be boring with books. You can't read everything. This is advice and guidance. Don't try to read everything. read what you can and read what is helpful. But I will say, be on your phone less. Wesley was very adamant at the start and end of your day, you should end your time in scripture and in prayer. Be doing that. And I say that I in my sermon this past week, I was very convicted writing the sermon. It's like, yeah, I'm not very good about that. I'm very bad about being on my phone way too much. But read old histories. This is Plutarch, the rise and fall of Athens and Greek lives. And there's secondary literature. This is primary literature. If you don't have time to read a bunch of things, I recommend reading large summaries of history. This is one example, though it's focused on the 14th century. You can generally find books this big that cover a large period of history. This is called A Distant Mirror. Now, this is not going to be for everybody. Well, one, it's thick. Two, this isn't a Christian history. As it describes in the back, this book reflects two contradictory images. On the one hand, the glittering age of crusades, cathedrals, and chivalry. On the other, a world plunged into chaos and spiritual agony. I read a lot of secular historians as well. It's great. This stack of books is going to fall. Oh, but also read poetry, read epics, read fantasy, things like that, like Lord of the Rings. Read the Canterbury Tales. Though some people say this is a little crude. Yeah, I mean, it is. I'm not gonna lie. But it, of course, important historically. Dante's Inferno, things like that. I have that downstairs. The Song of Roland. This is short. This is both a poem and a introduction to the work. I could make a separate video on the Song of Roland. I'm trying to just find where the introduction is. So this is there's an introduction to this, and this is what I recommend. You can get just the old poems, but I recommend you get them with introductions. It's not for an introduction to the history, context, and stuff of a work that's not very big. There's a bunch of notes and the original French poem in the back. This is able to be read in a day. And then, of course, things like the Iliad. Read classics, stuff like that. Here's this. So this will probably depend on the person and what you mean by Methacostal. Pete Bellini, called Methodism 2.0. He said he would have called it Methacostal, but he felt that was too restrictive for what the group is, which is fair. And no, it's not synonymous with the primitivist position. So Methodism 2.0, in my experience, is far more leaning into the movements of the Spirit, not quite as much as the holiness tradition, more in between those two though. So we look at how the Spirit is moved in the Nazarenes, in the holiness traditions, in the Methodist movements. Now, that's not saying we go to the charismatic extremes, but there's an openness to what's going on there. And I think that's wise and that's good. Let's see how the Spirit's moved. Of course, you test every spirit. So you test doctrine by what's revealed in Scripture. You test prophecy, or what people think is prophecy as what's revealed in Scripture, stuff like that. I doubt I saw you there in Isaiah 3, just because I haven't actually been to Kentucky yet. I'm going for the first time this fall. My in-person classes have always been down here in Oklahoma, for the hybrid system, and then a lot of online classes. Yeah, I don't think I've gone anywhere other than the Tulsa satellite campus for classes. Um, I don't know too much about Billy Abraham personally. Um, he definitely strikes me as very much more on the moderate leaning conservative end from what I know. I could be wrong on that, just from my experience. Of course, the works I've read from his when they get published through like Oxford and stuff, if you want for a work to get published through Oxford and Co., um, you have to write it in a certain way or they just won't publish it. So that impacts how it gets written and stuff. I did not touch on the GMC Anglican future earlier just because here we're focusing on global Methodism first, at least for this stream. I think that can be an important conversation in terms of identity. That's probably worth its own stream. But I don't see an Anglican Union happening anytime soon unless there is a schism in the ACNA over women's ordination. And that's just because the ACNA is fighting over women's ordination. The GMC has people who are not on board with women's ordination, and there's a range of views from like, I don't approve, but I'm not going to split it over it. I think it's a good position to be having if you're going to be disagreeing with it inside the Global Methodist Church. But I don't see a merger happening with the ACNA until they settle that issue in-house. Now, there is currently talks, and I saw this on a Facebook post, and I need to check this myself. So if anyone knows the source for this, please feel free to put it. I'm going to have to try and track it down later myself. I didn't have time to dig through it this morning. The UMC is probably merging with the liberal side of the Episcopal Church next year. If you hear liberal side of the Episcopal Church, you probably just think Episcopal Church. That's fair. That's probably happening next year. I'd be surprised if it doesn't. There is the Global Episcopal Church, and I saw something online earlier about there being talks that are possibly starting about the GMC and the Global Episcopalian Church having some sort of official communion. Oh man, you were in Tulsa 2 weeks ago. We could have met up. I didn't know, but actually that probably would have depended on my schedule and yours. It's been a crazy past really summer. This has been a very busy summer in a very good way. But yeah, so there's my advice for a lot of people with the GMC and how things are going to be going is study our history, study our theology, go to our systematics. I know that those can be long and boring, but if we're going to try and work this out, there does need to be a serious conversation. Now, that doesn't mean you have to do it all by yourself. Don't do it all by yourself. Be in talks of community with people. Form study groups. Study groups don't have to just work through the same book and things together, though that can be very helpful. There's also times that groups have been formed to sort of take on a task. So if you're going to address the question of identity, let's take just the doctrinal standards. You can get a group together and assign each person, you're going to study this part of the standards. You're going to write a history of this part of the standards and move from there. So one person would cover the sermons. Well, maybe not all the sermons of John Wesley. But like that would probably be 2 or 3 people. You have 2 or 3 people handle the sermons. One person handles the 25 articles. One person handles the confession of faith. One person handles the general rules, things like that. Benlini mentioned, I'll just put it on the screen. The emphasis of the fruit of love over the pento. Yes. Okay. Yes. So this was that excellent comment that highlights this. So, and I talked about this with Kendall Meek as well. That interview will be coming out next week, and I brought it up in my video with Pippolini. So a lot of the issues that have happened in some of the holiness movements is because of where their emphasis is placed on the spiritual gifts. So for them, not all of them. I have met many who don't do this. Yeah. They're voting. The UMC, I think, has already approved the Episcopal merger. I think the Episcopal merger has to be approved by the Episcopal Church next year, I think is when they're voting on it. That's what I saw earlier. I could have my details wrong on that. Feel free to fact check me. But with the, say, Pentecostal, they're sort of the easy ones to pick on. because of the extremes that pop up on shorts and protest media or protestia or whatever that Twitter handle is. And, their focus is on the gifts themselves. So that's where you get the weird speaking in tongues as a sign of this specific act of grace. Some people have said you have to speak in tongues to be saved. It's because their focus is so on the gifts themselves that they think it's necessary in a lot of ways. I say they being the people who are going to these excesses, to be very clear. And because of that emphasis on the gifts themselves, really as the means and as the end, it leads to a lot of abuses and excesses. That's why there's been a fair amount of scandals around the people who are like prophets. And you get the people who defend them are like, how would you ever question a prophet? How would you ever say that he's wrong? And that's when we're looking at what the Spirit's doing and including that in Global Methodism and leaning into the openness of the Spirit's movements, we need to guard against that. Because it's unscriptural to do that in the first place. We need to test everything. But a lot of that comes from that emphasis on the gifts. So prophecy, speaking in tongues, healing. Whereas for the Global Methodist Church and what we should be doing is focusing on those fruits. And when the holiness movement is at its best, that's what's happening, is when it's focusing on the fruits of peace, love, joy, patience, Galatians, Ephesians, 1 Corinthians, those come up. Those are the fruits. Those are the things we should be expecting to see in every believer. The gifts are not. The gifts are separate. Gifts go to a person as the Spirit deems it. I'll be preaching a version of John Wesley's Scriptural Christianity tomorrow as part of a summer with the Wesley series of the church I'll be filling in the pulpit for. And the opening of his sermon is Acts 4:31. They were filled with the Holy Spirit. And the opening paragraph of the sermon is he goes back to Acts 2 and says, this is a similar statement to what happened here. But the difference is in Acts 2, we see this big miraculous sign. We don't see that in Acts 4. And he just opens up saying, set aside the discussion of continuationism and understand the Spirit gives gifts to who he chooses for certain seasons and times. So that's going to be, I think, the biggest thing. If we're going to lean into what the Spirit's doing, we have to guard against the excesses by testing everything by Scripture, by the revelation that has been given, by not just, we want to be cautious against going too slowly, but we also don't want to go too quick. And we want to keep our focus on the things the Lord told us to focus on. So Christ, on the fruits of the Spirit, that's how we judge things. Stuff like that. We do not want our focus to be on the spiritual gifts themselves. That doesn't mean we aren't anticipating the Spirit to move and do things, but we can never let that be the primary focus. Oh yeah. So this is a big thing we do need to talk about is ecclesiology. And this is something that is happening. I know the Trinity Conference is having this conversation. So one thing that's happening, and I'll show this next comment, is this. This is a conversation the Trinity Conference is having, is who can preside over that's Trinity is like Texas and some other areas that are part of that conference, I believe. The conversation has been who can administer the sacraments. Now, I alluded to this earlier, and this is an important discussion, is in our identity in the Global Methodist Church is what is the role of an elder? What does an elder do? Are they just a part of the church that's lifted up from the priesthood of all believer for practical roles? Is there something else going on, or is there something else going on there? Is it this special spiritually empowered role that this person is called to specifically and lifted up for? Well, everyone should agree that they're all called to it. I know some people have had some weird thing about it's just a practical thing. No one's called to it. Yes, people are called to be a deacon. People are called to be an elder. These are not the same thing. I'm of the stance, and I know quite a few people in the Trinity Conference. There was a recent interview with Andy Miller IV. You can go find on this where they were talking about this. Elders are the ones who are to be administering things like the Eucharist, or bishops. Elders or bishops. Elder is just presbyter, and as we talked about with Pete, if you call it presbyter, priest, pastor, at some point you start arguing semantics. Someone filling the role of elder is doing what a presbyter, presbyters, or a priest is doing. whether you translate it as elder or priest. And historically, the role of the Eucharist is reserved for the elder. That's one of the things they're called to be doing. This can be extended, right? Lutherans have done this. There are various spots in church history where you might have a shortage, a temporary extension of authority to perform the sacrament can be done. How the early Methodists handled this was the circuit riders. They would go around, they would ordain the sacrament each week. That's how they do it. The Global Methodist Church currently has taken a bit more of a stance of extending authority. So we have deacons and stuff who, as long as they get special sanction by the bishop, can perform the Lord's Supper each week. The Trinity Conference has raised the very good question, is that how we should be doing it if it's reserved for the elders? And I think a good balance, and this was something they proposed, is if someone's an elder or going to become an elder, those are the people who should be performing the sacraments. Someone who's actually called to do that specifically by God. If someone says, I'm a deacon and I'm going to be a lifelong deacon, praise the Lord. We need lifelong deacons. That is not the same as an elder. There are plenty of people who feel the call to be a deacon, to preach, to teach, to help structure the church, to bring life. And that is what the Lord has gifted them to do. That doesn't mean that they are called to be performing the sacrament and sacraments and things like that. That's a different calling. And that's not a bad thing, right? That's by the Lord's providence. The Lord has designed that. So how do we approach that? I agree with the Trinity Conference. If someone's going to be a lifelong deacon, if they're going to be a lifelong lay license minister, they shouldn't be performing the sacraments. We should be reserving that for the priesthood and those going on to the priesthood. I can't. Hopefully we'll be able to do another stream like this. So I'm glad you enjoyed it, and look forward to more conversations. This is a question that we have to work through. I am not sure that will be something in the future. I can tell you right now there are plenty of Global Methodists who are very cautious on charismaticism. This also depends on how you define charismaticism. If you define charismaticism as Pentecostalism and the holiness movements, then yes, absolutely, there's room for that. And unless we decide to go with a holiness identity, there will probably always be room for that. If you define it as like cessationism and rejecting the Spirit moving in those types of ways today, probably not. And I could be wrong on that. I don't speak for everybody. Maybe there will be a way that tension is held in the future. But I see Global Methodism right now is moving in the same direction Wesley was in his own lifetime. And though Wesley was very opposed to enthusiasm, as he called it, that's more or less what we'd call charismaticism. He was open to the Spirit moving. There were times he did exorcisms. He had a deliverance ministry. Pete Bellini recommended his book. The title I can't remember. Thunder's in it. It's part of my class that's starting next week. My summer class. I need to go reread the title. I linked his books in that video, so you can go find a link to all his stuff there. But it's on his deliverance ministry. He had healings. There were times where he should have been more or less beaten to death by mobs and wasn't. And other Methodist pastors had been killed by mobs and things like that. And he attributed all of that to the divine sovereignty of God, though Charles Wesley did have some funny quips at times if he was just too short, so they missed the right spot. Oh, Charles. Man, I love those brothers. And things like that. So he was open to the Spirit doing things. So if you're defining charismaticism as the things we see in Pentecostalism and those excesses, yes, absolutely. If you define it as the Spirit moving today, I'm not going to say no in the absolute sense, but I would be very surprised. That's a good clarification there. Under the authority of. So, yeah. But that's something we're gonna have to. I suspect will be a hot button issue. I don't know if it'll come up at our general conference this year. So this is a life of the Global Methodist Church thing here. We have like 469 pieces. The last count I had was 469 pieces of legislation. I know some people have been trying to revise legislation to get it resubmitted. So that would include more than 469 pieces of legislation to be voted on at our annual conference this year. We're not going to, I would be very shocked if we get through 469 pieces of legislation. That is a huge amount of legislation to try and work through. So I don't know how much is going to get done this year and how much is going to get put off until a later conference. So I expect we're going to have quite a bit of conversations and formations happening in the terms of identity and writing out things in the Book of Doctrine and Discipline for some time yet. But I know, so I'm in the Heartland Conference. I'm down here in Oklahoma. We cover more or less the Midwest. We've got 5 states and 2 churches up in Canada. I'm very excited about those churches up in Canada. I want to try and get a hold of them sometime. I just have to actually send them an email. Or if someone sends us to them or they watch this, feel free to reach out to me. My email's on the YouTube channel, practicalchristianlessons@gmail.com. I'm happy to talk about GMC things all the time. Let me go and remove this one just so my name's on there for people who are also wondering. And one thing we've been talking about, and this is something that is going to be a big shift for the American part, probably all of the Global Methodist Church, is that we're actually a global church, and not just on the identity and label of global, of like, what does it mean to actually be a global church? So as a practical example, the underground churches around the world, we don't know most of their elders and members. And the GMC does not have many records electronically of that, because if those ever got like hacked or leaked, those people have state powers and other forces at work who want to take their lives because they're preaching the gospel. Well, we're not going to go around making that information easy to get as a consequence of it. That's something we have to keep in mind. In the Book of Doctrine and Discipline, in the past, it's been very specific on what benefits someone gets. But let's take health insurance. There are places around the world, like fair amounts of Africa, where health insurance is not really that helpful, as it turns out, or places where the healthcare is government and public. Private healthcare is not something that's going to be a great appealing benefit for pastors in some of those areas. So how are you providing benefits for your pastor? How are we accommodating people who have to travel multiple days across deserts or things like that to get a plane in another country to fly to conference? Because if they were to fly to conference in their home country, they would be arrested and executed. How are we going to work through those things? How do we handle the public confessions of faith and public ordination services? Places like the Church of China can't necessarily do it like we do it in America. So what does that actually look like? I know one proposal's been, we have the Book of Doctrine and Discipline, and it gives you must do X. You must provide benefits for your pastors or ministers. And then local context will determine what those benefits look like. So the Book of Doctrine and Discipline will say, here's our guideline. Here's the benefits you need to be looking at and providing for your ministers. And then it's up to the local context to figure out, okay, how do we provide that benefit in the best way possible for our local context? Whether that's happening via conference meetings, whether it's something that's never defined, I think it should be something that local conferences do define within their own context. But I am a fan of the Global Methodist Book of Doctrine and Discipline that binds everyone. Is less specific. It needs to be specific enough to be relevant, but not so specific that it hinders other contexts from actually following out these things. Yeah, so this is also fair. I think speaking in tongues is not the hamala shamala type stuff. That's the meme version. I just love the phrase hamala shamala. I think it's a great phrase. I think it's more of speaking in earthly languages. You know, I have met several ministers, and I'm not going to say his name because I didn't get permission from him to share the story. Dang it. I should have talked to him. Who go down to places like Mexico. And I know of Baptist ministers where this has happened, where they've been somewhere and they've asked for a translator, whether that's for a prayer, for a sermon or something. And then when it's all said and done, it come to figure out they were speaking the language of the people there, or at least the people could understand them. And this can be like, you know, someone prayed and then he's like, why did you ask for a translator when you speak our language so well? And he's like, what are you talking about? I don't speak your language. And he's like, well, you just did. or in private conversations or in evangelistic contests, stuff like that. So yeah, I think if this is the approach you're coming from, there will be room for this. I just, for you and for everyone else, that conversation then needs to be very clearly, we need to define what we mean by charismaticism. So, because when you just say charismaticism, there are going to be people who think you mean what you're talking about, and there are going to be people who think you mean you're a cessationist. Different words get used different ways, and that's just a feature of humanity. Yeah. So one last question is, do you think the General Conference will have to happen more often than 6 years between General Conferences? I think at first, if we want to get through all this legislation, it will. We're going to get through 469 pieces of legislation. That then just raises the struggle of a question for the Global Methodist Church. For us in America, it can be a lot easier to, of course, host conferences locally, but it can be pretty easy for us to acquire resources to fly out of the country in comparison to other places. But like this year at the Heartland Conference, we were going to have some speakers from Africa come in, the bishops, and they were not allowed access because their visas were denied. And that's because of some of the current policies around immigration in the United States. And I am all for tightening up on illegal immigration. That's been a problem in the United States for a while. I was a fan of more of what was called the open door policy. At least this is just to provide some context of where I'm specifically talking about here, where people would come up normally from South America. They would work during harvest season. It was fairly easy for them to get work visas. So they would do it the legal way because it was easier and safer. They'd come up, they would still make more money than they were going to make back home, enough to live on here and send money back home. We were getting to tax that income because they were here legally. So they had every privilege of trying to find legal work that pays well. And it's not hard during harvest seasons to go out and work. So their country's getting money because they're getting taxed the money. We're getting money because we're getting taxed the money. They're getting money for their family more than they were going to be making back home. And then when they go back home, they keep working there and then come back for the next harvest season. That was a system as far as handling work immigration that I think has been a lot better than a lot of the stuff we've tried. That being said, illegal immigration is not good for any country. I'm very much a Romans 13:1. We're following our government until they start commanding us to do things that go against God's laws. And that can cause some sticky situations. It can cause some unideal situations, like right now with our African bishops not being able to get into the country as easily as they were a couple of years ago. But it is what it is. So if we try to have it more than every 6 years, even for Americans, it's going to be expensive to fly out to other countries. Or if we try to do it here, which we don't want to do as often, like there's a reason there's been one in Costa Rica, the next one's in Africa. We do want to be a global church, so we want to be having it in those places. Then, there's going to be a conversation of how often can people actually do that? Because we can't just reliably meet via the internet. Internet's not as stable in other places around the world. Internet's not as easy to get in other places around the world. So there's also the issue of internet lag. Communication's harder over calls, especially if you're going to have a conference-sized event. You'd have to have something that can handle that bandwidth, something that, and of course, all the translators, we'd have AI, but it's not perfect. It'd have a lot of issues. I do know Ryan Dinger's work. I do like a fair amount of his work. I like his sacramentology work. He's done some really good work there. I could try and talk to him. We've had some disagreements on Rome. So I know I've talked with you about this. I am not as friendly towards Rome as a lot of Methodists. Something I talked about on my stream. And this is a conversation that we also have to have. What does ecumenicism look like in the Global Methodist Church? I personally have issues with the fact that on one side, Rome seems to be pretty friendly and very ecumenical, sometimes a little too ecumenical, and very much moves into liberalism, and it's really bad. But then on the other side, you have Catholic Answers, who is a officially funded and officially approved apologetics network. They have magisterial approval. And they have people like Joe Heschmeyer who come up and say, Protestants do not worship God because we do not have the sacrifice of the Mass. They have people who are saying that we're teaching a bunch of false teachings. You have Casey Chalk on there constantly talking about the obscurity of Scripture, and he is called Unitarians Protestants. Joe Heschmeyer has done the same thing. Unitarians aren't even Christians, so they can't be Protestants. He's called Quakers Protestants. He's made a bunch of fallacious arguments. So we have Rome, as claiming to be the infallible institution, has on one end, extreme liberalism, on the other end, extreme anti-Protestantism, and then a bunch of stuff in between. And there are a lot of great faithful Roman Catholics, and I fully expect to see a lot of them in heaven one day. I'm not on board, though, with being super friendly towards that kind of an institution that's going to it's not just an allowance. I'd understand if it was allowance, but it's officially supporting both of these ends and funding both of these ends. Catholic Answers, of course, they don't get all their funding from the magisterium, but they're like millions of dollars a year. They're a huge network, and they go around doing a bunch of anti-Protestant stuff. And then on the other end, you have a bunch of people who are like, we might as well be Roman Catholic as far as they're concerned, is in terms of, are we part of the church? We are. There's no question for them. So I think there needs to be some work out there. I think there has to be, if we're going to be in a discussing formal communion, I'm all for, like Wesley in the Sermon on the Catholic Spirit, seeking unity where we can have it, working together where we can, and we can do work for the kingdom with those who are faithful. But if we don't come to a point where the things that led to the papacy, if we led to the things of claiming infallible tradition that leads to damnations on other people, if those don't get removed, they're just going to pop up again. History has shown us that. Hey, you mentioned it at the same time I did. Wesley's a Catholic Spirit. If anyone hasn't read that sermon, it's a wonderful sermon. I think it's a sermon. See, that's fair. The only issue I have is Rome. Hey, I'll put you up here. I'm going to put you up. Rome is very central on its institutional unity. So its fringes do impact the center for them in a way it doesn't for us. But that's something to try and hash another time. This is Adam, and Adam, I won't forget to ask you the questions that I forgot to ask Quattro. Shame.
All right.
I'll put them in the private chat as well. Adam's a friend of the channel. He's been on. Those did not paste into the chat like I wanted. I guess I'll just ask them one at a time then. He's been on, I think we were on the same panel, right, with Jeffrey Rickman. Yeah, we were on the same panel with Jeffrey Rickman on the proposed articles of religion. You're in the Southwest Conference?
In the Western Pacific Conference. We just renamed.
Was it the Southwest Conference before?
No, it was the Western States.
Okay, so I was just wrong all around. That's okay.
I'm in Bishop Carolyn Moore's conference.
Yep.
So,
yep.
I mean, we had some tongue speaking,
Yeah. You and Willie can debate it in the chat when this is said and done. So my first question, I'm going to raise my desk up here, so I'll mute myself for a second. Is how long have you been a Methodist?
Oh man, I've been a Methodist going on 2 years.
Okay. If you want to give a brief history of your story of joining the Methodist Church.
Yeah, so it's actually a great thing. I've been a Wesleyan longer, but I grew up in a Christian household. So my parents began taking the faith seriously and going to church when I was in the womb. So I had that kind of experience where at least I got church. I was able to do that, but they were going to a Pentecostal church. So it's kind of it's a little funny that we're in Carolyn Moore's conference too. So Bishop Carolyn Moore. And so I got that for about 20 years, 21 years, 22 years, where I was going to that church, or at least in kind of those spaces in California. Then I moved out here to, or not out here, I moved out to Texas. And I started going to a Southern Baptist church, forgive me. And because I don't know, it was really hard for me because I was into apologetics a lot. So I needed the reason and everything like that, and I thought I could get it there. And I love my Southern Baptist brothers, but could not. And then I really started to do like a lot more research. I started to develop my kind of my philosophical style, my theological style, and so I was there for a while. But I was really starting to look into like Wesleyan theology. Like, it was really funny because I had a lot of Roman Catholic friends who were really trying to get me to go to Rome, because I went to a Roman Catholic school as well for undergrad, and so a lot of them were really and they were a lot of faithful Catholics, and they really wanted me to join. I led a group in college too, and so there was a lot of Catholics that were just trying to get me to join, and some who were Protestant who went over to Catholicism who were trying to get me to join. And I never did. I mean, I would watch their things and everything like that. And I'm like, there must be something more, there must be everything like that. I started to really read the church fathers, and like, I was like, but I was unconvinced because of the claims weren't as ubiquitous as they said that they were. I mean, I'm like, I see when I read the fathers, I'm like, I believe these things, and they seem to be even having nuances among themselves. But I'm like, but it did challenge me in my ecclesial kind of understanding of the church. And I'm just like, oh man, I really don't like congregational polity. I really, I'm like, oh man, I really don't like rebaptisms, and then I was going to a Baptist church, and I'm like, I can't be here, like, in good faith. And so my brother, he started working at a Methodist church, at a Global Methodist church, back in June, 2 years ago to the date. And I had even gotten on a mission with the Southern Baptist Church, like to like Boston area, because that's a place of need, which it is definitely. My place where I live too in Las Vegas is most definitely as well. But I was just feeling, and I was going through some things in 2024 as well. And I was just feeling like this, I can't do this. And then I started going to a couple services at the church, and like I said, I had been Wesleyan already, and man, it was just, this is where I need to be. Sacramental theology, the church service, hymns and everything like that, but also the preaching. People, I mean, I said this, like, people got so caught up on like the craziness of the UMC that they left out. I'm like, faithful Methodist preachers are extremely good, but they fly under the radar because we're not this big box kind of like evangelicalism that has like, social media guys at the ready to like cut and paste every little thing. So that's kind of my story. Sorry about that. And then since then, I moved out to Las Vegas, and I go to a church out here, and my pastor is the conference superintendent, so I get a lot of inside baseball really quick.
Yeah. My presiding elder. Well, I move around. I think I'm technically a supply pastor officially. Maybe I'm just functioning as one. I don't know. But the presiding elder of my area is over the church. It's like the central church in my area. So I've got a lot of good conversations with him. I'll actually be interviewing him next week, I think, on liturgy, because he's on the team forming liturgy for the future. So awesome. That'll be exciting. But yeah, no, I know a lot of Methodist churches, like, they don't even have streaming.
Oh,
like, all over the place.
We do a stream. It's small, but we do actually do one.
Yeah. So denomination settled, Global Methodist. So what content do you, like, active Global Methodist content do you watch in the modern day, other of course than liking and subscribing and hitting the notification button for my channel, of course?
Nice shameless plug. I watch Pastor Jeffrey Rickman's Plain Spoken. Like, I'll watch that a lot. I watch a lot of Seabed. Like, I started watching like the 7-Minute Seminary like a long time ago, and I was glad I was glad I started watching that before like any Reformed content. For me, the reform content, I'm sorry, online was like it was just a lot of slop for me, because I'm just like, okay, this is like the little slogans that they say. And then what else? So I watch his a lot. I watch Seabed. I do a lot of reading, man. Like that's like my big thing.
I'll call me biased, but I think reading is probably the better. I mean, it's not biased. It has been recognized. Reading is the better medium for learning and thinking and working through things. It's also just there are a fair amount of people. If reading, you struggle with reading and need to learn how to read, which might be a surprise. I don't mean like literally learn how to read the letters on a page. I mean learn how to read well. Mortimer Adler wrote a book called How to Read a Book, and I highly recommend that. But yeah, that's something that a lot of people kind of struggle with nowadays is reading books.
Yeah. And I'll watch, the Global Methodist podcast as well. I'll listen to the Asbury. I'll listen to the Asbury podcast. I think it has one of the Watsons. I don't know.
It's David Watson.
Is it David?
I know Kevin was on a recent one with David to discuss their new book, Faith and Fire. I don't know how often Kevin's on there. I know he's on staff with them, so I imagine he's there a fair amount of time.
Yeah, and then I know, what is her name? Tessia Artesia Mallory is on there, I think, sometimes too. She's the Dean of Chapel, something like that. I listen to The Art of Holiness, which is Bishop Dr. or Carolyn Moore's podcast. So she has some really interesting people on there sometimes. And then I listen to, obviously, Joshua Pearsall's podcast, and his content. That was
the best mediocre podcast on the channel.
And and then the big one, obviously, Method Ministries. I listen to Lucas a lot. He actually got me really he sucked me in. I've talked to him for like over 2 years, and he's like, you should go like here. And yeah, he's kind of like a mini Jordan Cooper in that sense, where he got me to like really join, even if he's not in the denomination himself. But that's kind of like what I consume.
Yeah. Hey, well, he's working on it. He's working on the church.
Oh, I would love him. We need more traditionalists.
Yeah, I know there's another podcast. It's like a morning devotional. There's the morning prayer website that exists by Shane. I'm forgetting his last name, but it's basically like the closest thing we have to like a Methodist Book of Common Prayer that comes out digitally every morning. And then there's from Seedbed, they have a I think it's called Wake Up Call podcast, but that's more of like a devotional thing. So, okay, just curious on that. If you don't watch Andy Miller and Matt O'Reilly, I command you to go subscribe to that.
Oh yes, I forgot about them. Yes, I do watch Andy Miller and Matt O'Reilly. Don't worry, I have a liturgy content too. I try to do liturgy for our
you all in your blurs.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I try to do that kind of stuff and consume that kind of stuff.
Right, the next question I have here. So this is more of these were historic practices for the Methodist historic teaching. And are you involved in any class and or band meetings? Or have you been involved?
Yes.
Okay, so you're actively involved. Good.
Yes. I lead a class, actually.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. It's not with other Methodists, sadly, but at least I'm, because there's not a lot that are like my age, but as well. But I know it's not just supposed to be like one age group, like all the time. So that's one thing that I want to branch out and doing more. And
that's super old school Methodist.
Oh, really?
Last meeting with non-Methodist.
Oh yeah. No, we do it. I mean, it's funny. It's funny that the theology will come up sometimes, and we'll be like, I'll like leave it alone, because they're Lutherans. But yes, I've done that. Been a part of a band, actually restarting one, because a lot of us like redoing a band style meeting, because there's a couple of us in there who are actually like actively going into ministry, and I'm like, hey, like we'd rather not have scandal before we get into ministry. And so it'd be better if we just do this as like a practice where we're just checking in on each other and going deep with one another, because I think people who go into the ministry maybe might have a deeper understanding of what grace calls. So even if we're struggling with the sin, we know that there is grace preached. So
good.
But yes.
I fully agree. And I know one of the things that the GMC has been very big on, and has historically actually been a very contentious issue within the Methodist world, that's entire sanctification. Where do you fall on the entire sanctification spectrum? For, against?
Oh my gosh, that was one of the things that drew me in. That was people would be like, they would misunderstand it, like especially when I was first like getting into it, before I even joined a Methodist congregation. They would talk about this perfection, and I was like I guess a little skeptical at first until they really understood what it actually meant. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is totally possible. And I'm like, I've seen this, and you can see this, and people like who are at least either kind of close or who have kind of achieved it, in the sense of like they just are filled with, they want God, and they have just ultimate love for neighbor, while also standing by truth. And and their heart has been just filled with that, where I mean, obviously it's not sinless perfection, but you see it play out in their life. Is just filled, it's just they're content in God, so much so that their desire for sin is just not, it's just not there in that sense. And so I definitely like see that, and I feel like that's what made me like that. That's what put me on kind of being that this is possible through via the power of the Holy Spirit, because the Bible describes us as new creations, and that's why I really, really don't like this is why I have a hard time like with other denominations too, besides Anglicans, because there's still room for us, at least there a little bit. But yeah, that's why I had the pious maxing, where like, I'm such a sinner. It's almost kind of like an excuse to say like, oh well, I don't allow the Holy Spirit to do the work in me that I ought to. And a part of it is just the theological and doctrinal understandings that other denominations have, and so people are kind of locked in to that box. Like one of the things I couldn't be I love my Lutheran brothers, but I couldn't because of their always saint, always sinner kind of understanding of the Christian life. And that was one thing that Wesley said. They're great on justification, did not go far enough in any on other theology. And so but yes, I do agree.
Yep, good. You're on the right track, friend. That's been something I know the Global Methodist Church is very, very big on. I think that will be a key thing for us going forward. So when you look at the Global Methodist Church presently, of course there's the question of what's our future going to be. But when you look at the Global Methodist Church currently, what do you see as currently binding on our identity, if anything? And what do you think is unifying us right now? And how should we be interpreting those things? That was a big question that came up with Pete and I, is interpreting the things that are going to be unifying us.
That's tough. I mean,
yeah, that's probably a very big question.
Yeah.
And that might be something you have to work through as well. But if you want to speak briefly, you don't have to answer every part of that.
Well, the biggest, okay, I'll answer the latter part first. The bigger thing that I see that is like binding us right now is that we're not UMC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's like our identity, or at least our present kind of understanding that it's that. But I'm like, you don't just have a negative kind of identity like that you're not something. That's reactionary. That's not, or that's kind of like what, I hate to say it, what woke rightism is right now. It's just reactionary to everything that is like on the left, or all the degeneracy, without building something. It's like just tear down everything without having to build anything up in its place, or what is being built up in its place that they have is like horrible. So we don't just want to be against. And so that's what I see. I guess the articles are kind of binding, kind of. I see people give at least some deference to it and to our doctrine and discipline, but it's not like, I don't think people are super like steeped in it as they ought to be. And so what do you see as the things that presently bind it? Part of it is also just, I guess, maybe having some, at least out here in the West, like movement of the Holy Spirit. That's like a big thing that is binding us out here, you know. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing either, because we are going to kind of need that out here, out in the West, and having those streams is decent, because at least people out in West are used to kind of, a lot of charismatic Christianity came out of here. A lot of kind of big box non-denom is out here. So having some of that might not actually be bad, but it has to be kind of within what I call the kind of the traditions, the structures of the traditions, as the foundation. And that's what when I was talking with you the other day about that, it's not to the chagrin of the others, like what you have down here. It's like as the baseline as to what what I am is like the baseline. It's not like the getting rid of the other ones. So
yeah. And I know there, so to give some background there, and then this just segues nicely in the next part of the conversation. You were talking about how you fall on a 5, and you mean that in a primarily a 5, but much like Quattro, and I think I am falling on, where 5 is sort of a root, that historical, the traditions of the church as we've inherited them, the liturgical practices, and letting that be a firm foundation for us, because that was a firm foundation for Wesley. No need to mess with what was good, and then from there find out how these other things fit with that.
Yeah, for me, I'm very much a Wesleyan Methodist. So like Wesley's theology, like I'm very close to it. High Church Anglican. I like when for example, I know Sid too. Like, when I spoke with him one time, we were going to Asbury at the same time. We crossed over, and in the fall, and I went over to his to speak with him. He had me over for lunch, which is very nice. I got to meet his daughter too. Wonderful. He and I, like, our theology. He's a Wesleyan Anglican, so like he and I, like, our theology is like there's almost like no difference. Really, like, there might be a few things here and there, but overall, it's like, I want to recapture that liturgical practice. Like, I even like to dress in English style. Like, I don't even want to wear it's not that I don't want to wear the Geneva robe, but like I would much rather wear like a cassock and a surplice on top of it than that. But yes, I do believe that it's like a 5/1. I think that is like the for me the foundational. It's like we all want to really have a good understanding of that, or at least leadership does. And then I understand the kind of the Methodism 2.0, but I even would probably even prefer holiness before that one. But at least those are like the two legs. Like, we want to understand what God has been doing, how things have been moving, and then have a really like spirited kind of understanding of the faith. I think all that can be done within if we recapture our roots really, really, really well. And then we say, well, this is at least the foundation. And then those things, those two other things, we like Methodism 2.0 and holiness can like flow out of it. I think that kind of is a better understanding than not like getting at least our liturgical practice, and then our class and band meetings in order. Once again, before moving on to Methodism 2.0 and holiness, I think those are tantamount to a bustling Methodist denomination. But that can only happen if you have a foundation of 5 and 1, I think 5/1.
Yeah.
And then, but yeah, I really don't have any care for the Big Ten kind of thing. I'm just like, no, you can throw that one out.
Yeah, I suspect that's probably where most people fall in my experience.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I see a threes in chat. He knew Sid as well.
I think 4 is like, yeah, we're evangelical in the, I think, classic sense, but big box like evangelical with a capital E ecosphere, I think is like, no, we need to get rid of that, because it's just not. No, I don't think that it's not fruitful. People who sadly go to some of these churches have a very, very shallow understanding of the Christian life, not just theology or doctrine, but the Christian life. People don't realize that this is a life that you're getting into. It's not just something you tack on to your life. And I think it's, I think North American Christianity has fallen into that consumerist mindset. I even heard the Lutherans talking about it as well, because their, synodical voting has been happening, and everything, and so they're talking about, how can we do this? How can we do that? And I'm like, guys, you guys are falling into it as well because you want to compete with the big box non-denominational church down the road. No, I said, you have to remember you're inviting people into a Christian life. And if you're going to be Lutheran, invite them into that flavor, right? Yeah. For us, we're going to be Methodist and holiness people, and we'll invite them into that. And part of it should be inviting them into an understanding of the English Reformation, which I think is the best one. The Lutherans will disagree. The other continental might disagree, but I definitely think it is. But I think that can only happen with us is if we're 5 and 1, and it'll really then show what people have. I think, like you were saying, congregations that give more and expect more from their congregants, I think, are going to tend to do better now. Not just competing with those people, and the Christians who come, if you offer them messages, because I've offered other Christians who are some of these big box evangelical things, and you kind of see the seriousness at that point. I'm like, hey, like, we're doing this. You want to come in? We're going to be doing these things. Like, we're going to hold each other accountable. It's deep accountability. And they're like, yeah, I'm not really like, on board with that or anything like that. And I'm like, okay, then you see the kind of the seriousness. Maybe they're not ready. I don't know. But, but yeah, at least in that one, on that question, I'm pretty firmly, I'm like, no, we need to really get back to roots, understand our roots, have that as our foundation, get that right, and then we can move on to the other ones, or else we're just going to be trying to recreate the wheel for ourselves like all the time, and nobody's going to be happy.
Yeah, and I know in terms of Big Tent, I mean, we could arguably say that's kind of what the UMC was, because the UMC wasn't grounded on doctrine as the unifying principle in its identity. It was grounded in, we're working towards a common goal. And that common goal, and it was more like a social gospel in the foundation. Like, we agree on feeding the poor, so maybe our doctrine doesn't matter as much, maybe a bit of an oversimplification. But for a lot of the UMC foundation, that's how it was. So we kind of see what that looks like there. One thing I'd want to ask you in pushing for this position is, why favor, say, 3 over 2? Oh, don't worry, we'll get to number 5, but why favor holiness over Methodism 2.0?
I guess because it's more historic. I just tend to lean that way. I admit that it is. I admit that it's just kind of my preference. Give me at least what's like more historic, and I'm not saying that Methodism 2.0 isn't. It's like taking that into account, but I'd rather, like, because the holiness did push on like entire sanctification. We at least had people there who were like pushing entire sanctification in those kind of movements, in those kind of Wesleyan holiness movements. And so there's that. But I also see Methodism 2.0 as a stream that can also kind of uphold some of our identity as well, because like we want to know the global South has been growing, and I see that, and a lot of the times like those people in that has been really growing in those areas, like in like the global South, tend to be even more orthodox than a lot of like us, And I'm like sometimes like the simplicity of their understanding the gospel is something we need to knock ourselves, wake up call sometimes. Like, when you think you're in a dream, it's like pinch yourself. It's like they're that. And so I think that is helpful for us to understand the simplicity, but I don't think that it constitutes everything, because we still have a lot of work to do in the West, and in our countries as well. It's not like I want to do things in the global South. I want to do that. I want to build up churches there, but also we're lacking here in America and in the West as well. Like our people are also struggling, and that's okay for us to really build back as well, and not just focus elsewhere. Our mission field is also down the road, and so. But I mean, it just, maybe I'm just not as akin to it, because it's not that I'm against it. It's just, I don't want to move the historic identity posts. And maybe that's how I got the feeling of some Methodism 2.0, that it's willing to maybe move some of the old goalposts. And I'm like, I'm unwilling to do that, but I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. And I think it's one of those things, there's a spectrum on the Methodism 2.0 side where there are maybe people who are very much in the let's do a new thing and move away from some of those past things. And then on the other end, you have we need to be rooted in that past to move forward. And that's quite a few of the people I've had on the channel.
That's me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Be rooted in the past, but like I said, it's not to the exclusion of like charismatic. It's never to the exclusion of it. I don't think any of us are saying that, because I'm not a cessationist. I'm not any of that. So,
one thing I'd ask on 5, and this would be, I imagine, something that people will answer in different ways, and I think it relates to what Nicaea 3 is talking about in the chat. And when you talk about Anglican and recovering our roots in that sense, what are some of you think the key things then to be returning to that need to be part of the foundation that our identity is being built out of? He's bringing up the ecclesiology, the structure of the church, which is I've talked about a few times here on the channel, and a sacerdotal priesthood, stuff like that, and anything else, liturgy, hymns, how we approach scripture, whatever you think is key to that Anglican identity that you want to be
returning to.
Yeah.
Return to Canterbury, of course. No, one of the things I think, reaching out to them, at least from a practical standpoint, like starting to reach out, maybe starting to do certain, at least works of mercy with them, with a lot of Anglicans, at least getting that, and it's like, but one of the things, yes, it's going to be liturgy, opening up the Book of Common Prayer again, understanding that, bringing structure to people's prayer life in that way, I think is helpful. I mean, the Book of Common Prayer is great in that. And so I think, the structure of the church, the ecclesiology, like being strong on that, and so I think that is just helpful, like understanding that a bishop is like, okay, they're gonna like be on doctrine. They're going to be strong on doctrine. They're going to be that, and we have a clear kind of structure in that way. Understanding what the English roots of the Reformation are. I think the English Reformation, I think, asked a little bit of a different question than the rest of the Continental Reformation, and understanding why that makes us a little bit more distinct in terms of our heritage, because that's our heritage too. Starting to, I think, to read more people like Richard Hooker, starting to read Thomas Cranmer, those guys who Wesley was reading and really loved. I think that that's important to understanding, at least, to get to a better understanding of how we can best identify that. But doing some of the practices, yes, a full liturgy, doing a communion liturgy. I was thinking that if I was to plant, because my pastor wants me to plant out here in the city, because we have like no faithful Methodist churches besides ours. I would love to do communion every week. That's another big thing. Anglicans do it every week. Another thing to recapture that is doing that every week, and at least doing the full communion liturgy once a month. At least, and things I think like that can help us. Having dialogue, I think, with more Anglicans is in order, I believe, as well, but just understanding, but having that clear structure, having that clear understanding of what a bishop is going to do, I think is just kind of an important part. The liturgy, the liturgy is kind of like, when you think of Anglican, that's what you think, and so moving towards those worship practices, once again, and I think kind of that whole life, getting a prayer life, a structured prayer life in that way as well, praying like the office and things like that. And that's going to have to come from us, the clergy and everything like that, before it can come from, the laity. But I think things like,
I think you'd be surprised if you get the laity involved, how much of a difference that can make.
Oh, of course. Invite them to at least pray. Obviously you can't start them like, okay, let's do this every day. You better be at church. We're going to do a prayer. You obviously have to be pastoral, but I think, at least introducing them to those things, such that this is just the Christianity that they think is natural. And I've talked to my mother about that a lot, because my mother and father are also class leaders at their church. And so I've told them, this is not going to be just like us sheep stealing. There might be a little bit of that. And I don't mean it by sheep stealing. I mean, people who come, hey, there's a new church in town. They really like or dislike the preaching. They're coming to either hear the preaching or maybe criticize the preacher. Who knows?
Yeah.
But if you're really creating new disciples, like with what the early Methodist movement was, you put them in these kind of structures, and that they think that this is just what Christianity is from the onset: a class meeting, a band meeting, accountability, love, watching over each other in love. And, it just helps in the depth of the spiritual depth that they have. So, but I think that the Anglican Methodism is just, it's going to need to be done a lot by clergy, reading, understanding, continuing to learn about our history, and that, even Wesley was not trying to create anything necessarily new. It was more just revival within the church to awaken them.
Yeah.
And so I think that is a good understanding. But the BCP, reading some of the great Anglican guys, and, and understanding that, and reading Wesley too, because he was Anglican.
So I hear you focusing a lot on, say, Anglican sources, which is, understandable. Other than Wesley, do you feel like there's Methodist voices as well then to be including in that foundation for the identity? So when you're looking at the Anglican, sounds like you're not looking at, say, later Anglican voices. It's just those earlier Anglican voices.
Yeah.
How do you then approach, say, people like Henry Wheeler, if you know who that is, or William Burt Pope, Richard Watson, some of the later voices that came in Methodism? Where do you think they have a role, if any, in then returning to these Anglican roots and then carrying it forward?
Yeah, I think that they do. I've heard, I know Henry Wheeler and some of the names. I definitely know William Burt Pope.
Yeah.
I haven't read as much as I would like to of them. But obviously, like, I'm busy and I have a ton of other reading to do for seminary, as you know. But I would like to sit down and read more of their works as well. But I mean, William Burt Pope was from England himself, so I know that, and I know, like, for example, I was doing some reading on Thomas Coke, and he definitely was more like, high church type guy, at least a little bit from what I've read. And so I think I think they're definitely, I think some of those early guys kind of had that kind of similar understanding of what the church is. And so, but I just need to do more reading on it, and reading on their voices, because I do think that they definitely hold weight as well. I just was, and especially being kind of, because I'm a 5/1, being a primitivist as well. Like, I need to we need to read those guys at the same time, kind of, so that we understand where we come out of and what the early guys were doing in order to create that kind of transformation that they were seeking within the church, the Church of England at the time. And so, I also watched that one movie, A Great Awakening, which is pretty cool, but that was focused on George Whitefield a lot, and we don't have many Calvinistic Methodists anymore. So,
well, they kind of don't exist anymore. They all, from what I know, the Welsh. I mean, I'm sure there's some random Welsh Methodist congregations, but most of them went Reformed, from what I understand. Like, they actually joined Presbyterian bodies. There was a funny quote from one of the Welsh Methodist ministers in the last century from over there. He said, it was along the lines of, if you ask what's the difference between the Welsh Methodist and the Reformed that were there, I think they were like the Netherlands Reformed or something. He said there isn't one. He said the same thing. It was funny. I'd say, if you don't have this book, then definitely get this. This is it'll still be like a short resource book, basically, to have once you get time to actually read some other things. I know that's always going to be the struggle with seminary. So I know Henry Wheeler, he came later. He was born in 1835. He was very much an American circuit writer and church historian. You could probably read his biography that exists. It's all of about 2.5 pages. There's not much. Unfortunately.
Like, I want to read Adam Hamilton's work.
Okay. Too. So you are interested in going past those earlier figures. I'd say that probably puts you more in a 5 and 1/2 then. So one of the things, of course, it's a scale that on the primitive side I've seen is a fair amount of people aren't as interested in the later figures. I guess a good test figure would be like, how do you approach Francis Asbury? Because there are a bunch of people who love what Francis Asbury did and his work, and then there are a bunch of people who they're not very loud about it, but they hate the impact Francis Asbury had.
No, I don't necessarily hate the impact. I need to need to read more. I need to just read more on those things, because I've been so steeped in, like, at least getting us back, like, let's just be Protestant. Like,
yes,
please.
Yes.
And the best way to do that is also to, like, be Anglican, or like have our, like, understanding of our Anglican roots. And so that's where one of the big things, like, it's okay for us to say baptism saves. It doesn't mean that it'll, like, keep you saved till on the day of judgment, because we believe in we believe that you can lose it, if you do not have faith. Things like that, just that we can start to use at least Protestant language once again, and like classically Protestant language about these things. And then once we have that, we can start to flow in other stuff. But I just have to read more. I think maybe my understanding from what I've briefly read, I probably have a preference for Coke.
That's fair.
But I go to Asbury, so I have to, like, at least I have to give some deference to Francis Asbury. But what are some of the things or opposition that you have heard about his impact or anything like that, if I might ask briefly?
So Asbury was very much when he came to America, he leaned into the American identity. This was one of the things that Asbury understood, Wesley never got. So, like, one of the big tensions between America and England is America has always been far more fiercely individualistic.
Yes.
It wasn't quite as bad in Asbury's day, but especially post the Revolutionary War, after over a decade of England not sending priests, there was no priests being sent over for funerals, for weddings, for baptisms, for just daily life. They were like, no, we're not doing things like England has done things. So when Wesley approached the American Methodists with this, I'm going to be sort of the one in charge and running things, the American Methodists were very much the, no, you're not. We respect you. We appreciate everything you've done. But that's not how things work here. We're going to be voting on things. We're going to have a democratic election on these things. And when Asbury came over, Wesley was just saying, you're going to be the guy. When Asbury came over, he said, they're going to vote on if I'm the guy. That should have been the first sign for Wesley that things weren't going to be quite like he was. And Asbury understood that. I think Coke got that as well. But it led to a very big difference then in how they sort of moved forward. For Asbury, it was a lot more of leaning into that frontier American identity than the English roots he came from. Not that he dismissed his roots, but he never returned home. When he took the mission to come over to America, and that's why I have a lot of respect for him, even though I don't agree with him on everything. He gave up the love of his life. He was going to get married in England. He had everything set out. When he came over, he never went back home. He never saw his mom again, I don't think. He didn't see the love of his life again. And he spent the rest of his life never owning a home. He never owned his own property. He spent the rest of his life traveling and working with the American Methodist Church.
What is it with Methodists and having a hard time with their love life, man? I mean, I have to admit that that's me, but
take some lessons from Charles. Charles had a wonderful
marriage. Yeah, he had like a wonderful marriage from what I hear. And his kids stayed in the Church of England, I believe. His family did.
Yeah.
And but no, yeah, I definitely, from my understanding of Francis Asbury, from what I have read or from what I have seen, is like that is definitely the kind of understanding. And I understand that as well. Like, it's good to have a kind of it's good to have an individualism, at least on a kind of like political understanding. I think that that's what characterizes America. But what has happened is that thought, especially in North America, even in the West too, or just in the broader West and Europe too, is that has become so hyper individualized, where any received authority is seen either circumspect. And I'm like, no, like one thing that I've had to really like shrug off is like when we worship, it's not just a bunch of individuals having private moments with Jesus. Yes. I think a lot of Americans, and I think a lot of Westerners, a lot of North Americans do not understand that.
Yeah, that definitely needs to be a big shift.
And I'm like, you have to hold those two things in tension, where your political preferences, your kind of American identity on how we view things can be held, whereas like your church identity, which is obviously the more important, sits under that. Is like when we go to worship, it's not about your own individualistic preferences. Now this is about us together worshiping, the risen Christ and worshiping the living God right now. And that has been the biggest thing where I have had to change my mindset. It also helps in understanding, I think, theologically, like election and everything like that. So that's why I think it's, when we have that understanding, it's better, because when you worship like that, when you have that worshipful understanding and you actually practice it, it actually helps you understand theology better, because it's actually practiced and lived. What does election mean? What does the body mean? Things like that. And people can have a better understanding of what that is. Because it's now a corporate thing done. And as I appreciate that of Asbury, but I just, But yeah, I think that is something, that nuance, that careful nuance, is going to be important for our movement, because we don't want to just fall into this hyper individualism as a church. We want to hold both things in tension. That the individual does matter. The individual has gifts, they do, but also we're a body of Christ. We're a body, and we're a corporate body that we do things together towards Him. And so,
and I mean, I know you're not saying this, but just in case anyone would think it, for Asbury was not on the hyper individualism side. That was something that developed. It's definitely the natural consequence of some of the ways of thinking that were done, but it's not. When we look at the older early American sources, they were certainly more individual than the English houses were, but it wasn't quite the same. The Methodist.
Yeah, I don't think Francis Asbury would be like, yeah, you can self-define and like change your gender or something like that.
Yeah, not on board with that.
Yeah,
and he certainly did have a few changes that came in with him, which of course is going to happen with a big cultural change, like going from living in British cities that were, well, it's not like the frontier was really that much morally better, but going from the Victorian city life to, we literally have to build our towns out of the woods we're going through and deal with people we've never interacted with before and develop new language and stuff like that. And, the Methodists didn't always handle that well.
No.
But yeah, that was a big development. Someone did put in the chat, the Methodist Church is kind of the American church.
I don't disagree.
Yeah. There was a point, every county in America had a Methodist church.
That's crazy.
Which is, yeah, that wasn't that long ago.
No, of course not. That's what I tell people. Like, that's why I tell them, like, at least for me, like, I'm not trying to get political, but like, that's one of the things that why I say I'm like conservative, because I'm like, hey, when you want to conserve the American spirit, like, part of it is like being Methodist, because they transformed the landscape, the moral landscape of America so deeply that I believe, that's the flavor of, because like even non-believers today have a sense of morality because of how much Christianity has affected the West. So they borrow kind of like our, ethical understanding, because I'm like, trust me, it's not a natural understanding. If you were living, like, if you were a pagan, like, you would have had a very different understanding, of a lot of things. I mean, some of them are kind of getting back to it, because the early Romans would just leave their babies out in exposure, and the Christians would pick them up. I mean, they're kind of doing that with abortion. I mean, the language is just like, oh, well, like, they're disabled. The Romans did that too when they found a disabled baby. They would just like, I don't know if you saw the recent controversy with that guy, Jesse, or something like that. And his wife. Yeah. And Dr. David Watson, he wrote on that from Asbury, the president. And he's just saying, like, this is just like a neo-pagan worldview. He's like, he's like, the Romans did the same thing. Oh, our baby's disabled. Just like get rid of it, So yeah, but yeah, it's one of those things, understanding how much Christianity was introduced or steeped with Methodist flavor here in the United States.
Yeah.
And giving to the poor, doing those things is kind of that thing. And it's funny because we didn't have a government who did that during the American frontier. That was like churches doing that, and that were helping when things went hard and everything like that. So, I mean, it's just, if you want to be like a true red-blooded American, be like Methodist or something. Like,
Be a Methodist. Read this book. This is my word. Of course, I think you're probably gonna have to read this for your polity class if you haven't had it anyway. Maybe you've already had.
I haven't yet. I'll have it this fall.
Oh, yeah. I think I'm taking it this fall too. I'll have to double check. This will be one of the textbooks, I believe, for the polity class. It's the story of American Methodism. So
is yours like? Do you have a hybrid as well?
No, I'm taking the course of study.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I switched my master's to a master's of biblical studies since I'm going to get a PhD, and I'm doing the course of study at the same time. And a lot like when I first started at Asbury Seminary, I was still finishing up my undergrad, so I was in two schools at the same time.
Great. We need more scholars within the in the Methodist kind of like ecosphere. I mean, I'm trying to do a MABTS as well, or MABS as well. But,
yeah, I didn't intend to talk about that today, but I think that's an important thing, and I know people have been talking about with that. What's the role of a bishop? Talk about something that's important to the identity moving forward. I think the GMC's identity of what a bishop's going to be is pretty firmly settling on. They are a teacher and a spiritual shepherd helping organize the church, rather than how the UMC interpreted what a bishop was, which was different than how some other flavors had interpreted before them. I think one of the things for a lot of the GMC pastors and professors that kind of might need to be a mind shift set, and I've noticed a fair amount of Asbury professors they've probably been like this since before I got there, but I've noticed it with them, where they're very focused on, it's not just an academy here. We're actually forming people who are going to be shepherds. We're not just giving them information. Whereas for a lot of the Christian academy has been for a while, you're here for an education. Your spiritual formation isn't necessarily as important. And they stopped looking at the role of a professor as a spiritual shepherd and in a pastoral sense. Whereas, and that's sort of, what went wrong with the Methodist Academy is a lot of people moved from, this is as much a pastoral role as it is a teaching role, to it's a purely academic role. And that caused a lot of issues. I think what we need is a lot of pastors who are leaning into an academic side, not fully, but need to move a bit more into that. And a lot more academics who lean into the pastoral side a lot more heavily than historically.
Yeah. I think that it's one thing that, like, for example, me and our friend Philip, you see his great threads on X. He has said that as well, like leaning into the academics. I think, pastors need to start becoming more well-read. This is just like across the church Catholic, not just our church, not just our part.
Yeah, this is an issue for everybody.
Yeah, because it's like now people have a theologian in their pocket, or at least what they think it is, right? And if you're not ready and read and well enough steeped in good theology and apologetic kind of framework, you're gonna have people going off in really weird and different directions, within our churches today, and that's not just a problem of our churches. And I don't know if our pastorate or our elders are ready for that. I mean, I know I've heard some kind of Luddite language a little bit amongst them, and I'm like, okay, even if you are a Luddite, like, it's still a reality.
Yeah.
And it's not going away. And so you have to either be prepared, or you're going to like lose some of your congregation, or you're just not going to be able to keep up.
Yeah.
And
I know one of my, I'm not going to say who it was. If he watches this stream, he can feel free to comment. He told me recently that earlier this year, last year, he got a text message at 3 a.m. asking, what's an Enoch? Talking about the book of Enoch, because someone had found out about it and was asking questions. And I'm like, my first question is, why are you phrasing it like that? The second is, why are you texting him at 3 a.m.? What are you doing at 3 a.m. to be looking up at the book of Enoch?
So somebody actually asked that. I had a Bible study this week, and I go to a Bible study at another church at it's an LCMS church, because our church is still really small, like, so we don't have a full-fledged young adult Bible study. And someone asked about that. They're like, well, what's the Apocrypha? And I don't think the pastor, I don't think he explained it like super great, and I stayed quiet, but because he was he was like, well, like he's like, they have like really weird stuff on it, like the Gospel of Thomas, and I'm like, well, that's like New Testament apocryphal. When we talk about like apocrypha, we're talking about like the Maccabees. We're talking about Astra, and they're like, and then one guy said like, because like Christians never like, or like at least the church never like used it to like main doctrine. I'm like, well, like I said, Jude did, like, he quoted from like, I think Enoch.
Yeah, he quotes from First Enoch. He makes a very notable change in the citation, but he does cite it.
Yeah, he does. And I'm like, those are the things that like you need to be like aware of as a pastor. right, and everything like that, and almost like, well, a lot of I'm sure Luther, because like had that in his Bible, like at least coming up. I know in the Church of England they still had the Apocrypha up until like the 1800s or something like that.
Yeah.
So when Wesley was walking around with his KJV, it had the Apocrypha. It had Maccabees. I mean, they didn't see it as like necessarily as authoritative, but it had at least some commentary that they would read in the Book of Common Prayer. They have Maccabean readings.
Yeah. I guess just to give a brief history of that. Also, if we want to get super academic, the technical title for the Gospel of Thomas stuff, most people call it New Testament Apocrypha. It's technically pseudepigrapha. So pseudo is false. So it's like falsely attributed. Whereas the Apocrypha is technically, they're not false writings. Well, some of them may have been, but at large, they're not false writings. They're just not scripture. But almost no one brings that up. Just so you're
they're more like
super nerdy things I know.
They're like commentary, and they're good for understanding kind of intertestamental time period and understanding and thought process. I've seen some Arminians like go on it, and they're like, when they read the Apocrypha, it kind of gives you kind of a view into the mind of like that Jewish backdrop. And a lot of them say, they had like they say it's like almost like a proto-Arminianism, like how they were starting to understand.
I definitely wouldn't say that about the Apocrypha, but that's one interpretation.
Yeah. No, what I mean is like at least the thought process of like they were thinking about, we can't get to, God has to be the first mover, and there's like a grace that goes before, kind of for at least from what I've understood of some Armenians, into the backdrop and thought process of that helps kind of in that intertestamental period of understanding at least the mindset.
Well, it would have been some of it. Some of it was definitely works-based thinking. There was as much variety then as there is now. I know for at least the Church of England, and technically this view isn't excluded from the Methodist position, and I know many Methodists would probably still hold this, is the Apocrypha. Let me know if this makes a sound in the microphone, and I'll stop. But the Apocrypha were a collection of books that were good to be read for education and historical context and spiritual nourishment, but they were not there to derive doctrine from. And that's the stance for many throughout church history, not all, but many, and the stance that the Church of England has and still does, and the Lutherans and many others.
Yeah, I agree with that stance.
Yeah, it's a good stance to have. Quattro said, I vibe with reading Enoch at 3 a.m. I vibe with being in bed firmly by 3 a.m. I forgot where I was going to go with the rest of that. But yeah, so there's that. I know this is one of the things that's been an interesting tension in Methodist identity. So Henry Wheeler makes this comment. Kevin Watson points this out in his book and in his interview with Jeffrey Rickman on Plain Spoken over his recent book, to the bottom of the pile, the doctrine or spirit and doctrine and discipline on the history of American Wesleyanism at large, where before the Methodist movement became more academic, there was a fairly large amount of not just growth, but orthodoxy. And for them at that time, a large amount of their focus was on the orthopraxy. This wasn't to the exclusion of good doctrine. And clearly you still had great minds. Like if you read Henry Wheeler's exposition of the articles, even though he makes a comment that, we have avoided some of the heresies that we could have faced because we aren't in this academic mindset like others. He then proceeds to give a very good exposition of the 25 articles, and he goes through a lot of history and cites a lot of sources. So clearly he's not just like ignoring education and things like that. He's talking more about the academic mindset and that focus on the institution. So I think there is a balance to be had there of how do we educate ourselves, and also how do we avoid getting so focused on the academy and education it comes at the cost of some things. And that's been a big conversation for quite a few people of like, is seminary the only way forward? Or can we return to more apprenticeship models? can we return to other forms of education for our ministers? Does it have to be a seminary education? I don't think it does. But
okay, yeah. One of the things, I know it's a secular book, but it's called Intellectuals in Society. It's by Thomas, which is funny enough. He's an academic, PhD, economist. But if you really want to not fall into the pitfalls, I would recommend people read that book, because it just goes into depth into the mindset of how intellectuals think. And as a Christian, you don't want to fall into that kind of like mindset, or even if you're an academic yourself, and having some humility about things. And because when you become so steeped in academia, I guess, and I say this as one who loves to learn and loves academia and does well in kind of those structured environments. What happens is that you get so focused kind of on something, gets so educated that you start to believe that you can speak on on a breadth of issues that you know not much about. And that's what I think is part of that mindset as well. They get so high up in their ivory tower that an intellectual arrogance sets in, where they start to speak on things that they don't even realize they're speaking on, that they don't have as much understanding as a layman. It's a perfect example is like Richard Dawkins, or like or Stephen Hawking. They like would write certain philosophical things in their book where professional philosophers are like, oh my gosh, this is like a D- best in like an undergrad class, because their philosophical understanding was just so bad.
Yeah.
So, and that's that kind of like intellectualism mindset, where it's like you start speaking on that, you have that kind of arrogance, and as well as just, you make nuances of like 1,000 nuances, about certain things, rather than just saying, hey, like this is the truth that we know that's been passed on. And, but it doesn't mean that good research is out of order. Until I don't think God is beneath our reason. He's beyond it.
Yeah.
And so, and it's not to say we can't have some reasonable discussion, but to trust God is different from just knowing facts about him.
Yeah.
To trust God.
Our modern academic mindset, it's crept into the church pretty handily, has definitely been, we reason so that we can understand. Whereas I think the historic approach of the church, at least, and especially of the Anglican, or not just Anglican, the English branch, Anselm's the one we get this quote from. We don't reason so we believe so we can reason. That's
faith-seeking understanding.
Yeah, faith-seeking understanding. Of course, you can find a quote like that in Augustine, where he's tracing that back to before Anselm. And I'd argue we'd see things like that in like Proverbs 3, where it's like, don't rely on your own understanding, rely on God and his word and his testimony.
Yeah, amen. I see that on some of the stuff on the related points. Traveling elder to administer sacraments. I know we were discussing that the other day. I definitely do believe that. Obviously, that's going to be tough out here in the West. Because we have a really big, and our churches are really spread out. We have a really big territory, and our churches are really spread out. But but yeah, I mean, I think that kind of mindset is definitely in order to have. Once again, someone wrote, there are very specific reasons why Gregory of Nyssa spent time disparaging the philosophers of his day. Yeah.
We've Tertullian as well.
But the thing is, Gregory of Nyssa makes philosophical arguments too. Like, so he obviously had an understanding, but it was within kind of the milieu of like Christian thought.
I mean, this is the flip side of the academic issue. It happens with philosophy as well, where people will lift X above theology or X above faith. Like, I think William Lane Craig's a perfect example, where his philosophy is clearly leading his theology, not the other way around. Your theology should always be leading your philosophy. He's a great
philosopher, though, man.
He is a great philosopher. I can't I cannot argue that he's good philosophy. I think there's some times where he says things and I'm like, you're just being pedantic, or this is kind of sophistry, and you're way out to lunch. And then there's other times I'm like, yeah, I can't argue with this at all. I'm not even gonna try. But he definitely lets his philosophy lead his theology, and that's a big issue. And that's a lot of the issue with like the Arian controversy, what Gregory was addressing. And I mean, we see Wesley addressing that in his own day with, was it Hegel and some of the other philosophers of his time before his time and during his time.
I mean, but Wesley was pretty good at philosophy too. Like,
oh yeah, he was.
Like,
he's a good example of theology leading philosophy.
Yeah, he was like he would lecture on those things too. People forget that like Wesley was like a lecturer, at Oxford, and that he would lecture on logic and things like that, and he would teach those things. I mean, like he was an excellent like logician in that sense, like, and so I think that using philosophy as like the handmaiding again of like theology is helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously someone like Thomas Aquinas did a lot of that. I've seen a lot of like modern scholars get upset at Thomas Aquinas, like a lot of biblical scholars, because like, he would try to do like interpretation of text, and they're like, what is he doing? He didn't know the Greek and like Hebrew, and it's so funny. And so he would let his kind of like philosophical understanding and categories kind of let him lead to what the conclusion of what the text is trying to teach. And so it was really funny to see that, and to see biblical scholars like rip their hair out in like in some of the reading that I've read.
Yeah, I mean, he's brilliant, but yeah, he definitely was. I mean, of course, not everyone can master the languages, and I don't expect to be able to master the languages. But there needs to be some understanding when you're going through exegesis and stuff, at least some basics. I think most people will be able to get that. But clearly, we have like there are people who literally can't read and have been great pastors. Didymus the Blind was the head of the catechesis school in Alexandria, I want to say. And wow. I mean, he's called the blind because he was blind. But
literally, yeah. No, I like what he says here, that not his stuff, basically his stuff is really good. Yeah. So like I recommend on like time, like there was a discussion that he had recently with time and having a what that means philosophically, and having an understanding of what time is with like an atheistic theologian at like Oxford, I think right now she's at. And he just like, I think, blew her out of the water. And that's like, those are philosophical categories, right? Like the idea of time, what it means and everything like that. That was a really, really good conversation. But yeah, of course I disagree with him on like baptism. And I don't think that you need to have like a sacramental kind of stuff, or you need to have like, there's like grace means like, it's like some spiritual stuff or item that God confers, that there could be better understanding of it. Using philosophy, there's certain categories that still like maintain a sacramental approach, and that God confers or has, because grace is the action of God or disposition of God towards somebody. That's what grace really is: power and his presence in his life, something that you don't actually deserve, right, given your sinfulness. And so, there are things that I obviously disagree with him on, and so but yeah, no, that discussion I would recommend everybody to go watch. Like, it's a really good discussion on time, like the nature of time, what time is, So
yeah, talk about good philosophy question. Well, I am running towards the end of my time that I have available to be here today. So is there any closing thoughts or comments you want to have, since you're up here on the panel with me right now, on identity and global Methodism, and just either that and or an exhortation towards the people on your way out, since you will one day be Right Father Holy Reverend Adam?
It's so funny. I have some friends who already call me that, Father Adam, and I'm like, guys, I'm not an Anglican priest. So no, I just say, just keep fighting the good fight. It's worth it.
Okay. Praise the Lord. Well, thank you for taking your time out of this to talk talk with me today. Thank you, everyone who's been here around for this. If people want to have continue this conversation, please do so in the comments. I'm happy to try and find time to host another live stream in the future as well, if more people want to come up and try and work through some of these things. It's been a blessing, Adam. I hope it's been a blessing for the people, and let's keep the conversation going. God bless.
Yeah, bless you guys.